You've been lied to about being chosen. They told you that your value comes from being picked, from being noticed, from someone deciding that you are enough. But if that were true, why do so many people who are chosen still feel empty? Why does the feeling never last? Why do you still question yourself even after approval? The truth is, you do not need to be chosen to be valuable. Your worth is not something given to you, it is something that has always been within you. And Buddhist teachings have been pointing to this truth for centuries. The wisest minds discovered that peace does not come from being selected. It comes from releasing the need to be selected, from seeing clearly who you are without the noise of comparison. Tonight, as you listen, something will begin to shift. The need to prove yourself will start to dissolve. The pressure to be seen will begin to fade. Your mind will grow quieter, and you will feel something different, something steady. A sense of value that does not rise and fall with other people's opinions. And when you wake up tomorrow, you will no longer be waiting. You will no longer be chasing. You will understand that you were never lacking. You were only forgetting. This is not just something to listen to. This is a realization that changes everything. Are you ready? Let's begin. Now something begins to shift quietly, not on the outside, but within. The moment you stop waiting to be chosen, a question rises that most people avoid. If no one needs to approve of you, then why does your mind still chase approval? Why does it still reach, still hope, still depend on something it can never hold? This is where the deeper work begins. There is a subtle tension that lives inside many people, and most don't even notice it. It shows up in small moments. When someone looks at you and doesn't react the way you expected, when your effort goes unseen, when your words don't get the response you hoped for, something inside tightens, something starts searching, and before you know it, your peace is gone, replaced by quiet restlessness. This is the pull of external validation. It feels natural, it feels human, but it is also one of the most misunderstood forces shaping your life. From a very young age, the mind is trained to look outward. A child learns quickly that approval brings comfort. A smile from a parent, a kind word from a teacher, a reward for good behavior. These moments feel good, and the brain remembers them. Over time, it begins to build a pattern. Approval equals safety, recognition equals worth. But what begins as a simple learning process slowly turns into something deeper. The mind stops seeing approval as a bonus and starts treating it as a requirement. Instead of expressing itself freely, it begins to perform. Instead of acting from truth, it starts acting for response. And this is where the illusion begins. The illusion is not that approval feels good. It does. The illusion is believing that it can complete you, that it can define you, that it can give you something you do not already have. The mind begins to crave it the way a thirsty person craves water. But unlike water, approval never truly satisfies. It creates a cycle. You receive it, you feel relief for a moment, and then the feeling fades. And when it fades, the mind goes searching again. It becomes a loop. You adjust your behavior to be liked. You say things that will be accepted. You hide parts of yourself that might be rejected. You shape your identity around what gets the best response. And slowly, without realizing it, you lose connection with who you actually are. Not because you wanted to lose yourself, but because you were trying to feel secure. This is how subtle it is. External validation doesn't just affect your actions. It shapes your thoughts. It influences your decisions. It determines how you see yourself. When someone praises you, your confidence rises. When someone ignores you, your confidence drops. When someone criticizes you, your mind begins to question everything. Your sense of self becomes unstable, constantly moving with the opinions of others. This is why even people who receive a lot of attention still feel empty. Because attention is not the same as connection. Approval is not the same as understanding. And recognition is not the same as truth. The mind confuses these things. It believes that if more people approve, then it must mean something real. But numbers cannot create meaning. Opinions cannot create identity. They can only reflect perception, and perception is always changing. One day you are admired. The next day you are overlooked. One moment you are praised. The next moment you are questioned. If your worth depends on these shifting conditions, then you will always feel uncertain, and uncertainty creates anxiety. This is why the mind keeps chasing validation even when it already has it. Because it knows, deep down, that it is temporary. It knows it cannot hold it, so it tries to collect more, hoping that quantity will create stability. But it never does. The more you depend on validation, the more sensitive you become to its absence. Silence starts to feel like rejection. Neutral reactions feel like judgment. You begin to read into everything, searching for signs that you are still valued. This creates overthinking. You replay conversations in your mind. You analyze how you were perceived. You wonder if you said the right thing, if you acted the right way, if you were enough in that moment. And the more you think, the more you lose peace, because your attention is no longer in the present. It is trapped in interpretation. Buddhist teachings describe this as attachment to perception. Not just what is happening, but how it is seen. The mind becomes attached to being seen in a certain way, and anything that threatens that image creates discomfort. But here is something most people never realize. The discomfort is not coming from reality. It is coming from the expectation. Reality simply is. Someone responds or they don't. Someone approves or they don't. That part is neutral. The suffering begins when the mind says, "This must mean something about me." That interpretation creates pain. You assume that lack of approval means lack of value. You assume that being overlooked means being unimportant. But these assumptions are not truth. They are learned patterns, and patterns can be seen. When you start observing this process, something interesting happens. You begin to notice how automatic it is, how quickly the mind jumps from an external event to an internal conclusion. Someone doesn't respond, and the mind immediately fills the silence with meaning, not neutral meaning, but negative meaning, because the mind is wired to protect, and in trying to protect, it often exaggerates. It tries to prepare you for rejection by assuming it is already happening, but most of the time, it isn't. And even when it is, it does not define you. This is where awareness becomes powerful. The moment you see that your need for validation is a pattern, not a truth, you create space. Space between what happens and how you interpret it. Space between the world and your identity. In that space, something new becomes possible. You begin to question the old belief that your worth comes from outside. You begin to see how unstable that system is, and slowly you start shifting your attention. Not away from people, but away from dependency. You can still appreciate kind words, you can still enjoy recognition, but you no longer rely on it to feel whole. It becomes something you receive, not something you need. This changes everything, because when you are no longer chasing validation, your actions become cleaner. You speak more honestly, you move with less fear, you stop performing and start expressing. There is a quiet confidence that begins to grow, not loud, not forced, but steady. You no longer need every room to accept you. You no longer need every person to understand you. You no longer need every effort to be recognized. Because your sense of worth is no longer fragile. It is no longer built on reactions. It is built on awareness. You begin to see that your existence itself is not something that needs to be justified. It does not need approval to be valid. It does not need recognition to be real. It simply is. And in that realization, something softens. The pressure to prove yourself begins to fade. The constant scanning for approval begins to slow down. You feel less urgency, less tension, less need to control how you are seen. There is a lightness that replaces it. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of needing it to be. This is the freedom that comes from seeing through the illusion. External validation was never the source of your worth. It was only something the mind learned to chase. And like all learned things, it can be unlearned. Not through force, but through understanding. Every time you notice the craving for approval, you have an opportunity. Not to suppress it, but to observe it. To see it clearly without immediately acting on it. And in that observation, the grip loosens. You begin to feel less controlled by it, less driven by it, less defined by it. And what remains is something simple but powerful. A sense of being that does not depend on being seen. A sense of value that does not depend on being confirmed. A sense of self that is not waiting to be chosen. This is where real stability begins, not in the eyes of others, but in the clarity of your own awareness. And once you experience this, even for a moment, you start to understand something deeply. The thing you were chasing was never outside. It was always within. And it was never missing. It was only hidden behind the illusion that you needed someone else to see it first. And as that illusion begins to fall apart, something even more subtle reveals itself. It is not just that the mind seeks approval. It is that it waits to be chosen. Not loudly, not consciously, but quietly, in the background of almost every decision. A silent hope that someone, somewhere, will finally point and say, you are enough. There is a quiet discomfort in realizing this. Because once the craving for validation starts to loosen, another layer becomes visible. A deeper habit. One that does not just want approval, but selection. The feeling that life only begins when someone else decides you matter. And this is where many people remain stuck without ever knowing why. There is a subtle belief that shapes how people move through life. It is not always spoken, but it is deeply felt. The belief that worth is confirmed through selection, that being picked means being valuable, that being overlooked means being less. This belief is so normal that most people never question it. It feels like reality, but it is not reality. It is conditioning. From early experiences, the mind learns to associate being chosen with safety and importance, being picked for a team, being selected for a role, being chosen by someone in love. Each moment reinforces the same message. If you are chosen, you matter. If you are not, something must be wrong. And slowly, this message becomes part of identity. Without noticing, life becomes a series of quiet auditions. You start performing in ways that increase your chances of being selected. You adjust your personality. You soften your truth. You hide parts of yourself that might not be accepted. Not because you want to be false, but because you want to belong. And belonging in this system feels like being chosen. But this creates a hidden cost. The more you depend on being picked, the more power you give away. Your sense of worth begins to sit in the hands of others. Their decisions start to shape your identity. When they choose you, you feel elevated. When they don't, you feel diminished. And without realizing it, your inner stability becomes tied to external outcomes. This is the silent trap. It does not feel like a trap because it is rewarded. Society praises those who are selected. It celebrates those who are chosen. It builds systems around selection, jobs, relationships, opportunities, all structured in a way that makes being picked seem like the ultimate goal. But what is rarely seen is the psychological effect this creates. When your value depends on selection, you begin to doubt yourself in moments of uncertainty. You hesitate to act unless there is a guarantee of approval. You wait for signals, for confirmation, for permission. Your life slows down, not because you lack ability, but because you are waiting for validation before you move. This weakens something important: your inner authority. Inner authority is the quiet sense of knowing that does not require agreement. It is the ability to act from clarity, even when others do not understand. It is the confidence that does not need to be confirmed. But when you are dependent on being chosen, this authority becomes fragile. You begin to question your instincts. You second-guess your decisions. You look outward for answers that were already present within you. And over time, you lose trust in your own perception. This is where the real cost appears. It is not just about missed opportunities. It is about losing connection with yourself. Because when you are always waiting to be picked, you are never fully choosing your own path. You are reacting to the choices of others. You are shaping your life around their decisions. And even when you are chosen, something feels incomplete. That feeling is not confusion. It is misalignment. Being chosen by someone else does not replace choosing yourself. It does not create inner certainty. It only creates temporary relief. And that relief fades quickly because the dependency remains. You still need to be chosen again and again and again. This creates a loop. You seek selection, you receive it, you feel better for a moment, and then the need returns, stronger than before, because now you have experienced what it feels like, and the mind wants to hold on to it, but it cannot. Selection is never permanent. People change, circumstances shift, opportunities move, and when they do, your sense of worth is shaken again. Not because you have lost value, but because you placed your value in something unstable. This is why even successful people feel insecure. They have been chosen many times. They have been recognized, selected, elevated. But inside, the same dependency exists, the same need for confirmation, the same fear of losing it, because the foundation was never built within. Buddhist teachings point directly to this pattern. They describe how attachment creates suffering, not just attachment to things, but attachment to outcomes. Attachment to being seen, to being accepted, to being selected. When the mind clings to these outcomes, it becomes restless. It becomes dependent. It becomes fragile. Freedom begins when this attachment is seen clearly. When you understand that being chosen is not a measure of your worth, something begins to shift. You stop interpreting outcomes as personal judgments. You stop assuming that being overlooked means being less. You start seeing these moments for what they are: situations, conditions, not definitions. This creates space, space to act without waiting, space to move without permission, space to express without fear of rejection. And in that space, your inner authority begins to return. You start listening to yourself again, not the voice that seeks approval, but the deeper voice that observes, the one that is not influenced by praise or criticism, the one that simply knows. It is quiet, but it is steady, and the more you trust it, the stronger it becomes. This changes how you relate to life. You no longer see opportunities as things you need to be selected for. You begin to create your own direction. You begin to initiate instead of waiting. You begin to act from clarity instead of hesitation. And with each step, your confidence grows. Not because others approve, but because you are aligned with yourself. There is a different kind of power in this. It is not loud. It does not seek attention. It does not need to prove anything. But it is unmistakable. It is the power of someone who is not waiting to be chosen, someone who is not defined by external decisions, someone who moves with a sense of completeness. This does not mean you reject the world. You can still participate. You can still engage. You can still be chosen in different situations. But it no longer defines you. It no longer determines how you feel about yourself. It becomes something that happens, not something you depend on. This is the difference between dependency and freedom. In dependency, your worth rises and falls with external outcomes. In freedom, your worth remains steady, regardless of what happens. And from that steadiness, you can move through life with clarity. You stop trying to be what others want. You stop shaping yourself to fit expectations. You stop waiting for the moment when someone will finally confirm your value, because you realize something simple but powerful. That moment is not coming, not because you are not valuable, but because value was never something to be given. It was something to be seen. And the only person who can see it clearly is you. When this realization settles in, something inside relaxes. The urgency fades. The pressure lifts. The constant need to prove yourself begins to dissolve. You feel less tension, less comparison, less fear of being overlooked. Because being overlooked no longer means being less. It only means you were not chosen in that moment, and that is okay. Because your value does not begin or end with someone else's decision. It exists before the decision. It exists during the decision. And it remains after the decision, unchanged. This is the quiet strength that comes from breaking free from the need to be picked. It is not dramatic. It is not something others always notice. But you feel it, in the way you think, in the way you act, in the way you carry yourself. You no longer move from a place of lack. You move from a place of completeness. And from that place, life begins to feel different. Less like a competition, less like a performance, more like an expression of something that was never waiting to be chosen, only waiting to be realized. And once that need to be chosen begins to lose its grip, something deeper becomes visible. A quiet confusion that has been shaping your entire sense of self. You start to notice that even when you stop waiting for others to pick you, there is still a question lingering underneath. A question that feels simple but carries a heavy weight. What actually makes you valuable? Because if it is not approval, if it is not selection, then what is it? There is a strange feeling that comes with this realization. It is not fear exactly, but it is unfamiliar, like standing in a space where the old rules no longer apply, yet the new ones have not fully settled in. This is where many people turn back. They return to chasing approval, because at least it feels clear. At least it gives them something to hold on to. But if you stay here, if you remain in this space long enough, something begins to separate itself. Something that was always there, but hidden beneath layers of conditioning. You begin to see that there are two different kinds of worth, and confusing them has been the source of your struggle. There is the worth that comes from within. Quiet, steady, not dependent on anything outside of you. And then there is the worth that comes from society. Loud, visible, constantly changing depending on who is looking and what they value. Most people live their entire lives without recognizing the difference. They measure themselves using standards that were never designed to reflect who they truly are. They look at status, success, recognition, comparison. They look at how others respond to them, and they call that worth. But this is not real worth. It is social worth. And social worth is unstable. It rises and falls based on trends, opinions, and expectations. One moment you are admired, the next moment you are forgotten. One group values one thing, another group values something completely different. There is no fixed point, no solid ground. And yet, the mind treats it as if it were absolute. This creates confusion, because when your sense of self is built on something unstable, you will always feel uncertain. Even when things are going well, there is a quiet tension, a subtle awareness that it can change at any moment, and that awareness creates anxiety. You begin to monitor how you are seen. You adjust your behavior to maintain a certain image. You compare yourself constantly, trying to understand where you stand. You feel pressure to keep up, to improve, to stay relevant. And even when you succeed, the relief is temporary, because social worth is never finished. There is always another level, another comparison, another expectation. This is why so many people feel exhausted, not physically, but mentally. They are carrying the weight of maintaining an identity that is built on shifting ground. Buddhist teachings point directly to this instability. They describe how anything that is dependent on external conditions cannot provide lasting peace. Because external conditions are always changing. They are not under your control, and attaching your sense of self to something you cannot control will always create suffering. This is where intrinsic worth becomes important. Intrinsic worth is different. It does not come from comparison. It does not come from recognition. It does not come from achievement. It is not something you earn or prove. It is something that exists before all of that. It is the simple fact of your existence. Not what you have done, not how you are seen, not what others think. Just the fact that you are here. This may sound too simple at first. The mind resists it, because it has been trained to believe that worth must be justified, that it must be earned through effort, through success, through approval. But intrinsic worth does not follow that system. It does not need justification. It does not need confirmation. It is not something that increases or decreases. It is constant. And this is what makes it stable. When you begin to connect with this kind of worth, something shifts in how you experience yourself. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove your value. You no longer feel threatened by the success of others. You no longer feel diminished when you are overlooked, because your worth is no longer tied to those things. You begin to see that social worth is a role, not a reality. It is a layer that exists within human systems. It has its place. It can influence opportunities, interactions, and outcomes. But it does not define who you are. It is a surface. Intrinsic worth is the depth beneath it. And when you live from that depth, your relationship with the surface changes. You can still participate in society. You can still work, achieve, create, connect. But you are no longer dependent on the outcome to feel complete. You are no longer using success as a way to validate your existence. You are simply expressing what is already there. This removes a lot of pressure, because now your actions are not driven by lack. They are driven by clarity. You do things because they align with you, not because they will make you worthy. You move forward because it feels true, not because it will increase your value. This creates a different kind of energy. Less tension, less urgency, more presence. You begin to notice things differently. Moments feel more complete. Interactions feel more genuine. You are not constantly evaluating yourself. You are simply experiencing. And this is where freedom begins to grow. Not the freedom to control everything around you, but the freedom from needing to, because your sense of self is no longer fragile. It is no longer dependent on conditions. It is rooted in something that does not change. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. You start to see how much of the world operates on social worth, how people compare, compete, judge, elevate, and diminish each other based on external markers. And instead of getting pulled into it, you begin to observe it, not with judgment, but with clarity. You see that people are not intentionally trying to harm each other. They are simply operating within the same conditioning. They are also seeking validation. They are also trying to feel secure. And this creates compassion, not in a way that makes you passive, but in a way that makes you understanding. You no longer take everything personally, because you see that most reactions are not about you. They are about the other person's perception. And perception is shaped by their own experiences, their own beliefs, their own conditioning. This understanding creates distance. Not physical distance, but emotional distance. You are less affected by how others see you, less reactive, less defensive, more grounded. And in that groundedness, there is a quiet strength, a strength that does not need to be displayed. A strength that does not need to be recognized, but a strength that is felt internally. It shows in the way you carry yourself, in the way you speak, in the way you respond. There is less need to impress, less need to prove, more ease, more authenticity. This is what happens when intrinsic worth becomes your reference point. You stop measuring yourself against shifting standards. You stop chasing something that was never stable. You stop defining yourself through systems that were never designed to capture your full reality. And you return to something simple, something that was always there, a sense of being that does not need to be evaluated, a sense of value that does not need to be confirmed, a sense of self that does not depend on comparison. This does not mean you become passive or detached from life. It means you engage with life from a different place, a place of completeness instead of lack. You can still grow, you can still improve, you can still achieve, but these things are no longer tied to your worth. They are expressions, not definitions. This is an important distinction, because when growth is tied to worth, it becomes stressful. It becomes something you have to do in order to feel enough. But when growth is separate from worth, it becomes natural. It becomes something you do because you are curious, because you are interested, because it feels right. This makes the process lighter, more sustainable, more enjoyable, and this is where the mind begins to relax. It no longer feels like it is constantly being evaluated. It no longer feels like it is under pressure. It begins to settle. And in that stillness, something becomes clear. You were never lacking. You were only measuring yourself in a system that could not see you fully. A system that was always incomplete, because no external system can define something as complex and unique as a human being. Your value is not something that can be captured in a label, a title, a number, or an opinion. It is something that exists beyond all of that. And once you see this clearly, you stop looking for confirmation. Not because you are forcing yourself to stop, but because you no longer need it. The desire fades naturally, like a habit that no longer makes sense. And what remains is something steady, something quiet, something real, a sense of worth that is not given, a sense of worth that is not taken, a sense of worth that simply is. And from this place, you begin to live differently, not trying to become valuable, but finally recognizing that you always were. And as that quiet sense of intrinsic worth begins to settle within you, another layer slowly comes into view. It is more subtle than chasing approval, more hidden than waiting to be chosen. Because even when you begin to see your value clearly, something inside still whispers, "But I want to be seen." It is not loud, it does not always demand attention, but it is there, quietly shaping your thoughts, your actions, your reactions, a need that feels harmless on the surface, yet carries a deeper weight when left unseen. A strange tension begins to reveal itself. Even when you are no longer comparing yourself, even when you are no longer depending on others to define your worth, there is still a pull, a quiet urge to be recognized, to be acknowledged, to be noticed. Why does that pull remain? There is a subtle discomfort in this realization, because it shows that the mind does not only want approval or selection, it wants visibility. It wants to be seen, confirmed, reflected back by others. And when that does not happen, something inside begins to shrink. This is where the deeper layer of suffering begins. The ego's attachment to recognition. It does not always look dramatic. It often hides in ordinary moments. When you share something and wait for a response. When you do something good and hope someone notices. When you enter a room and become aware of how you are being perceived. It is quiet but constant. And the more attention you give to it, the stronger it becomes. Recognition feels good. There is no denying that. When someone sees you, acknowledges you, appreciates you, it creates a sense of warmth, a sense of confirmation. It feels like a reflection of your existence, but that feeling is temporary, and the mind begins to chase it. Not because it is wrong, but because it has learned to associate recognition with significance. It has learned that being seen means being real, being important, being valued. So it starts to seek it more often. You begin to notice how your actions subtly change. You speak in ways that will be heard. You act in ways that will be noticed. You present yourself in ways that will be acknowledged, not consciously at first, but gradually. And this creates a shift. Your life becomes less about expression and more about impression. You begin to measure moments not by how they feel, but by how they are received. You begin to filter your behavior through the imagined eyes of others. You begin to live with an invisible audience in your mind. This is where invisible suffering begins, because now your experience is no longer direct. It is mediated. You are not just living a moment, you are observing yourself living it. You are evaluating how it looks. You are anticipating how it will be perceived. And in doing so, you lose presence. You lose the simple, natural connection with what is happening. Instead, you are divided. Part of you is experiencing, part of you is watching, and the watching part is never satisfied. It is always looking for confirmation, always asking, was that enough? Did they notice? Did it matter? This creates a quiet exhaustion, not physical but mental, because you are carrying an extra layer of awareness that is not needed. You are constantly monitoring yourself, constantly adjusting, constantly seeking feedback, and the feedback is never enough. Because recognition cannot fill what the ego is trying to satisfy. The ego believes that being seen will make it complete, but the ego is built on comparison and identity. It is always measuring, always defining, always separating. So even when it receives recognition, it immediately looks for more, or it begins to fear losing it. This creates a cycle. You are recognized, you feel good, and then you begin to worry about maintaining that recognition. You become careful, you become guarded, you begin to perform consistently to keep the image alive, and this leads to tension. Because maintaining an image requires effort, it requires control, it requires constant attention, and no one can sustain that indefinitely. This is why people who receive a lot of recognition often feel pressure instead of peace. They are not enjoying being seen, they are managing being seen. They are trying to protect an identity that is fragile because it is based on perception, and perception changes. The more you depend on recognition, the more sensitive you become to its absence. Silence begins to feel heavy. Lack of response begins to feel like rejection. Neutral reactions begin to feel like disapproval. You start to interpret everything through the lens of visibility, and this distorts your experience. You are no longer seeing things as they are. You are seeing them as reflections of how visible you are. This creates insecurity. Not because you lack worth, but because you have tied your sense of worth to something unstable. Buddhist teachings describe this as attachment to identity. The ego creates a sense of self based on how it is seen, and then it tries to protect that image. It wants consistency, it wants confirmation, it wants to be recognized in a certain way. But the nature of life is change. Nothing remains fixed. So the ego is constantly struggling to hold on to something that cannot be held. This is the source of suffering, not the lack of recognition itself, but the attachment to it. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You start to notice how often your mind seeks recognition. In conversations, in actions, even in silence. You start to see how it influences your choices, and instead of following it automatically, you begin to observe it. You see the urge arise, you feel the desire to be seen, and you stay with it, without immediately acting on it, without trying to satisfy it. This creates space, and in that space, the intensity of the urge begins to soften. You begin to realize that the need to be seen is not who you are. It is a pattern, a learned behavior, a habit of the mind. And like all habits, it can weaken when it is no longer fed. This does not mean you reject recognition. It means you no longer depend on it. You can still be appreciated. You can still be acknowledged. But it does not define your experience. It does not determine your value. It becomes something that happens, not something you need. This changes how you move through life. You begin to act more freely. You express yourself without constantly thinking about how it will be received. You engage with others without needing their validation. You experience moments more directly, without the layer of self-observation. This brings a sense of lightness, a sense of ease, because you are no longer carrying the burden of being seen. You are simply being. And in that state, something interesting happens. You feel more complete. Not because others are noticing you, but because you are no longer dividing your attention between yourself and your image. You are whole in your experience, undivided, present. This is where peace begins to deepen, not as an idea, but as a felt reality. A quiet stillness that is not dependent on external feedback. A sense of presence that does not need confirmation, a way of being that is not seeking reflection. And from this place, your relationship with recognition changes completely. It is no longer something you chase. It is no longer something you fear losing. It is simply something that may or may not happen. And either way, you remain the same. This is freedom from the ego's addiction, not the destruction of the ego, but the understanding of it, the ability to see its patterns without being controlled by them, the ability to experience life without constantly referencing how you are seen. And in that freedom, something becomes clear. You were never incomplete without recognition. You were only conditioned to believe that you were. And once that belief begins to dissolve, you return to something simple, something steady, something that does not need to be seen to be real, yourself. And as the need to be seen begins to loosen, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Even when you are no longer chasing recognition, even when you are no longer depending on others to confirm your worth, there is still something happening in the background. A silent measuring, a constant checking, a subtle question that keeps returning without being invited. Where do I stand? It is not always loud. It does not always feel obvious, but it shapes how you feel about yourself in ways you rarely notice. You see someone doing better, and something tightens. You see someone behind, and something relaxes. Your sense of worth begins to move, not based on truth, but based on comparison. And this is where another layer of suffering lives. There is a quiet heaviness that comes from constantly measuring yourself. It does not announce itself as pain, but it drains you slowly. It follows you into your thoughts, into your decisions, into your sense of identity. It makes you feel like you are always either ahead or behind, never simply where you are. This is the habit of comparison. It begins early, often without awareness. You are compared in school, in ability, in appearance, in behavior. You learn to see yourself not as you are, but in relation to others. You are told who is better, who is worse, who is ahead, who is lacking. And over time, this becomes automatic. The mind starts organizing the world through ranking. You no longer just see people. You see positions, and without realizing it, you place yourself within that system. This creates tension, because no matter where you place yourself, there is always movement. Someone will always be ahead in something. Someone will always be behind in something. There is no fixed position, no stable ground. So your sense of self keeps shifting. When you feel ahead, there is a temporary sense of relief. But it is not peace. It is comparison in disguise. Because the moment someone surpasses you, the feeling disappears. And when you feel behind, there is discomfort. A sense of not being enough. A sense of needing to catch up. This creates pressure, and pressure creates restlessness. You begin to chase progress, not because it feels right, but because you want to close the gap. You begin to evaluate your life based on timelines that were never yours. You look at where others are and assume that is where you should be. But this assumption is flawed because it ignores something fundamental. No two lives are the same. Each person carries different experiences, different paths, different conditions. Comparing them as if they exist on the same line creates distortion. It simplifies something complex into something measurable. And in doing so, it removes truth. Buddhist teachings describe this as a form of delusion. Not because comparison exists, but because it is misunderstood. The mind believes that comparison can reveal value. But value is not something that can be measured in relation to others. It is not something that increases when you are ahead or decreases when you are behind. It is something that exists independently. But the mind does not see it that way. It is trained to look outward, to measure, to rank, to judge, and this creates a constant sense of movement. You are never still. Even when nothing is happening externally, your mind is comparing internally. You scroll through images, and your mind begins to measure. You hear about someone's success, and your mind begins to evaluate. You look at your own life, and your mind begins to assess, always in relation to something else. This keeps you disconnected from your own experience, because instead of being present with your life, you are observing it through comparison. You are not asking, what is true for me? You are asking, how does this compare? And that question never leads to peace. It leads to more questions, more comparisons, more evaluation. This is why even when people achieve what they once wanted, the satisfaction does not last. Because the mind immediately looks for the next comparison, the next standard, the next position, and the cycle continues. There is no end, because comparison has no final point. It is an endless process. And as long as your sense of worth is tied to it, you will always feel incomplete. This is where liberation begins, not by trying to become better than others, not by trying to win the comparison, but by stepping out of it entirely. At first, this feels unfamiliar because comparison has been a constant reference point. Without it, the mind feels uncertain. It does not know how to evaluate. It does not know how to measure. But this uncertainty is not a problem. It is a doorway. Because in the absence of comparison, something else becomes visible. Your direct experience. You begin to notice what actually matters to you. Not what appears valuable to others, not what ranks higher in society, but what feels aligned within you. This shifts your attention from outward to inward, from measuring to experiencing, from competing to understanding. You begin to ask different questions, not am I ahead or behind, but am I present, not am I better than others, but am I living truthfully? These questions create a different kind of movement, a movement that is not driven by pressure, but by clarity. You start to act based on what feels meaningful, not what appears impressive. You start to make choices that reflect your own path, not someone else's timeline, and slowly the tension begins to fade, because you are no longer trying to fit into a system that was never designed for you. You are simply moving in your own direction. This creates a sense of ease, not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer resisting your own pace. You are no longer comparing your journey to someone else's. You are no longer measuring your value based on external markers. You are simply living. And in that simplicity, there is freedom. A freedom that is often overlooked, because it does not come with recognition. It does not come with validation. It comes quietly, in the absence of pressure, in the absence of comparison, in the absence of constant evaluation. This is what makes it powerful. You begin to feel more grounded, more stable, less reactive, because your sense of self is no longer moving with external standards. It is rooted in something deeper, something that does not need to be measured. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. You start to see how comparison affects not only you, but everyone around you. You see how people judge, compete, and measure each other without realizing it. You see how it creates distance, how it replaces connection with evaluation, and instead of getting pulled into it, you begin to step back. You begin to relate to others differently, not as competitors, not as references, but as individuals with their own paths, their own experiences, their own timing. This creates compassion, not in a forced way, but naturally, because you are no longer comparing yourself to them. You are simply seeing them. And in that seeing, there is understanding. This also changes how you see yourself. You stop defining your life based on milestones. You stop feeling behind. You stop feeling ahead. You stop feeling the need to catch up or stay ahead, because those ideas no longer hold the same meaning. You begin to see that life is not a race. It was never designed to be one. It was only perceived that way, and that perception created unnecessary pressure. Once that perception fades, something else takes its place. Presence. You begin to experience your life more directly. Moments feel more complete. Actions feel more intentional. You are not constantly thinking about where you stand. You are simply engaged with what is happening. This brings a sense of peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer dividing your attention. You are not living in comparison. You are living in reality. And reality, when experienced without comparison, is much lighter, much clearer, much more stable. This does not mean you never notice differences. You still see them, but they no longer define you. They no longer create tension. They no longer shape your sense of worth. They are simply observations, not judgments, not measurements, just awareness. And in that awareness, something becomes clear. You were never meant to measure your life against others. You were meant to experience it, to understand it, to live it fully. And when you do that, comparison loses its power. Not because you force it to stop, but because it no longer makes sense, it no longer serves a purpose. And what remains is something simple, a sense of being that is not trying to prove anything, a sense of value that is not being compared, a sense of life that is not being measured, just lived, fully, freely, without the constant need to ask where you stand, because you are no longer standing against anyone. You are simply standing within yourself. And once you stop measuring your life against other people, another attachment becomes easier to see. It is softer than comparison, warmer than recognition, and far more seductive. It comes wrapped in kind words, in admiration, in approval that sounds harmless. But if you look closely, you begin to notice something strange. Even praise can become a prison when you start building your identity inside it. A few kind words can change your whole mood. A compliment can stay in your mind for hours, sometimes even for years. It can make you feel lighter, stronger, more certain. But there is something hidden inside that sweetness, something the mind rarely questions. Why does praise have so much power? And what happens when it becomes the mirror you use to know yourself? There is a quiet pleasure in being praised. It reaches the part of the mind that wants reassurance. It touches the part of you that has longed to be seen kindly. When someone says you are talented, beautiful, wise, kind, strong, or special, something inside relaxes. It feels as if a question has been answered, as if a doubt has been quieted for a moment, but only for a moment. That is where the deeper truth begins. Praise feels full, but it is empty in a very particular way. It gives a feeling without giving a foundation. It gives a moment of emotional warmth without giving lasting self-knowledge. It can brighten the surface, but it cannot build the center. And when the mind does not understand this, it starts depending on praise for something praise was never designed to provide. The problem is not that compliments are bad. The problem is that the mind often turns them into evidence. Someone says something good about you, and the mind says, "Now I know who I am." But how can another person's passing impression define something as deep as your being? Their words may be sincere, their appreciation may be real, but it is still only a perception. It is still limited by their mood, their taste, their worldview, their personal lens. One person praises what another person ignores. One person admires what another person criticizes. One moment you are called brilliant. Another moment, by someone else, you are called difficult. If you let these shifting voices define you, then you will never stand on solid ground. You will become a collection of reactions, a moving shape formed by whatever others happen to say. This is why praise can quietly distort the mind. At first it seems harmless. You receive a compliment and smile. But if you are not careful, the mind starts remembering what got approval. It starts shaping itself around what was rewarded. You begin to repeat certain behaviors, not because they are true, but because they are liked. You begin to lean toward the version of yourself that gets the best response. Slowly, almost invisibly, self-expression becomes self-editing. This is where authenticity begins to weaken. You stop asking, "What is true?" and start asking, "What will be appreciated?" You stop speaking from clarity and start speaking from strategy. You stop moving naturally and start curating yourself. The outer version of you may become more polished, more acceptable, more admired, but the inner version of you starts to feel less known, and this creates an odd kind of loneliness, because people may be praising what they see, while you quietly feel they are not seeing you at all. They are responding to the image, the role, the performance, the polished piece that fits their expectation. Meanwhile, the deeper part of you remains untouched. This is why it is possible to receive admiration and still feel unseen. Praise can land on the surface while your deeper self stays hungry. Buddhist teachings help reveal why this happens. They point again and again to the emptiness of fixed identity. The person being praised is not a permanent object. It is a fluid, changing process. Your mind, body, emotions, and roles are all shifting. So when someone praises you, what exactly are they praising? A behavior, a moment, a quality they noticed once, a version of you that appeared in a certain situation. Their words may reflect something real, but they can never capture the whole. This is why trying to define yourself through praise creates confusion. You begin clinging to descriptions. You want to remain the smart one, the kind one, the calm one, the strong one. At first, these labels feel comforting, but later they become pressure. Because once you are praised for being something, you start feeling responsible for maintaining it. You fear the moment when you will not match the compliment anymore. You fear disappointing the image that was celebrated. Now praise is no longer just pleasant, it has become a burden. You were called strong, so now you feel ashamed when you are tired. You were called wise, so now you hide your confusion. You were called kind, so now you struggle to express anger honestly. You were called beautiful, so now you fear change, age, or imperfection. A compliment that once lifted you becomes a standard you must live up to. This is how praise quietly turns into attachment. And attachment always carries fear. You fear losing what others admire. You fear no longer being seen the same way. You fear the silence that follows when the compliments stop. Because deep down, when praise has become part of your identity, the absence of praise begins to feel like the loss of self. But this feeling is built on misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is this, that praise reveals your essence. It does not. It reveals a moment of perception, nothing more. A compliment can highlight a quality, but it cannot define the being that carries it. Someone may notice your patience today and praise it, but your worth is not your patience. Someone may admire your beauty, but your worth is not your appearance. Someone may celebrate your talent, but your worth is not your skill. These things are expressions. They are not your core. This separation matters deeply, because when you confuse your qualities with your worth, you begin to live defensively. You protect the quality as if your existence depends on it. You become afraid of failure, afraid of flaws, afraid of contradiction. You want to remain consistent with the praise. You want to keep earning the same response. And this makes life very tight, very controlled, very performative. You become less willing to be human. You stop letting yourself be unfinished. You stop allowing growth to look messy. You stop admitting weakness where weakness is honest. You start living inside the polished version that gets approval. But the polished version is not the whole person. It is only the most approved fragment. This is why praise can create invisible suffering. Not because kind words are wrong, but because the mind uses them in the wrong way. It tries to turn them into identity. It tries to turn temporary feedback into permanent truth. And in doing so, it becomes fragile, dependent, easily shaken. One day, someone praises you, and you feel high. The next day, no one notices, and your energy drops. Then someone criticizes you, and suddenly the whole structure trembles. Why? Because your self-image was built from outside material. And anything built from outside reactions will always be unstable. Real self-knowledge is different. It does not come from hearing nice things. It comes from seeing clearly. It comes from honest awareness. It comes from watching your own mind, your own motives, your own fears, your own tenderness, your own contradictions. It comes from sitting long enough with yourself that you no longer need a polished story. You begin to know your heart directly, not through applause. This is much quieter than praise, but it is much stronger. Praise can excite you. Self-knowledge steadies you. Praise can flatter you. Self-knowledge frees you. Praise can comfort you for a moment. Self-knowledge stays when the room is silent. When you begin to understand this, your relationship with compliments changes. You can still receive them with warmth. You can still smile when someone speaks kindly, but you no longer build your house there. You no longer treat their words as the foundation of your identity. You let praise pass through you like sunlight through a window. You enjoy the warmth, but you do not mistake it for structure. This creates enormous freedom. You stop chasing compliments indirectly through performance. You stop shaping every action around how it will be received. You become less hungry for approval in sweet language. You become less wounded when praise goes elsewhere. You stop reading silence as a loss of value, because you no longer use praise as proof that you exist meaningfully. You begin to notice how often people are speaking from their own needs anyway. Some praise because they genuinely appreciate. Some praise because they want to be liked. Some praise because they are projecting an ideal onto you. Some praise because they only see one part of the picture. Their words may be kind, but they are still filtered through their own mind. Once you understand that, you stop treating compliments like sacred verdicts. This does not make you cold, it makes you clear. Clarity allows gratitude without dependence. You can say thank you without secretly inhaling the compliment like oxygen. You can appreciate being appreciated without needing it to stabilize you. You can hear beautiful words without handing them the power to define you. This is a mature relationship with praise. It is also a deeply peaceful one, because then, whether people notice you or not, whether they praise you or not, something within remains unchanged. You are not inflated by admiration, and you are not emptied by its absence. Your center remains your own. This stability becomes especially important in a world where praise is often public, instant, and addictive. People can now receive approval in seconds and begin craving it within minutes. Attention has become measurable. Compliments can arrive in numbers, reactions, and signals. This makes the attachment even more subtle. You may think you are just sharing, just expressing, just connecting. But if your peace rises and falls with the response, then the old dependency is still there, only wearing new clothes. The Buddhist path invites you to watch this carefully, not with shame, not with self-judgment, but with honesty. Notice what happens in your body when you are praised. Notice the expansion, the lift, the relief. Notice what the mind says next. Does it want more? Does it replay the compliment? Does it begin forming an identity around it? Does it fear losing that image? This is not something to condemn. It is something to understand. Understanding weakens illusion. The more clearly you see the emptiness of praise, the less power it has over your identity. You realize that a compliment can be pleasant and still incomplete. It can be generous and still limited. It can be true in part and still unable to touch your full reality. And once you truly see that, the craving begins to soften. You no longer need every good word to become a brick in your self-image. You no longer need admiration to confirm your direction. You no longer need constant positive reflection to feel real. Instead, you begin returning to a quieter source. You start asking yourself different questions, not "what did they think of me?" but "was I honest?" Not "did they admire what I did?" but "was I aligned with what mattered?" Not "did they see me as valuable?" but "did I abandon myself to earn that response?" These questions take you inward, and inward is where the answer has been waiting. The deepest part of you does not need compliments to know it exists. It does not need praise to become valuable. It does not grow larger when admired or smaller when ignored. It is already there, underneath image, underneath role, underneath public response, quiet, whole, unadvertised. This is the part of you praise cannot create and criticism cannot destroy. When you live from that place, life changes. You become easier inside. You stop performing goodness and start practicing sincerity. You stop trying to appear impressive and start caring about what is true. You stop collecting compliments like proof and start living in a way that feels clean to your own heart. Then praise becomes what it was always meant to be. A passing gift, not an identity. A kind echo, not a definition. A pleasant moment, not a foundation for the self. And once that becomes clear, something else becomes possible. You can be appreciated without becoming attached. You can be admired without becoming dependent. You can be seen without becoming trapped in the image of being seen. That is freedom. It is a very quiet freedom, but it is powerful. It means no compliment can own you, no applause can control you, no sweet opinion can become your cage. You remain open, grateful, and human, but inwardly untied. And in that untied state, you begin to discover a more stable dignity. A dignity not based on what others say, but on what you see directly in the silence of your own awareness. A dignity that does not need to be decorated by praise. A dignity that remains even when no one is speaking. That is why compliments cannot define who you truly are. Not because they are meaningless, but because you are deeper than language, deeper than labels, deeper than admiration, deeper than every good thing that has ever been said about you. And once you know that, you no longer need praise to feel full. You can receive it lightly. You can let it pass. And you can remain rooted in something far more real than approval. Something no compliment can improve and no silence can take away. And as praise loses its grip, something even more uncomfortable begins to surface. If you are no longer defined by compliments, if you are no longer chasing recognition, then another question quietly rises from beneath the surface. A question most people avoid because it feels threatening in a deeper way. If I am not special, then who am I? There is a strange resistance that appears here, because for so long, part of the mind has been trying to stand out, to be different, to be seen as unique, exceptional, above average in some way. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle forms. Wanting to be admired for something, wanting to be known for something, wanting to feel like you are not just another face in the crowd. And when that desire begins to loosen, it can feel like something is being taken away. There is a quiet fear that arises, the fear of being ordinary. There is a discomfort that many people never fully face. It is not about failure, it is not about rejection, it is the possibility of not being remarkable, of not standing out, of living a life that is not noticed, not praised, not elevated above others. And the mind reacts to this with subtle resistance, because it has learned to associate being special with being valuable. From early experiences, there is a quiet message that runs in the background. The ones who are noticed matter more. The ones who are exceptional are more important. The ones who stand out are more worthy of attention, respect, and love. This message is rarely questioned. It becomes part of how the mind understands value. And so, even when you are no longer chasing approval or praise, there can still be a hidden effort to be different in a way that feels significant. To have something that makes you stand apart. To hold on to an identity that feels above the ordinary. But this creates a subtle tension, because trying to be special is another form of dependency. It is still rooted in comparison. It is still tied to how you are seen. It is still based on the idea that your value must be proven through distinction. And this keeps the mind restless. You may not be chasing validation in obvious ways anymore, but you are still shaping yourself around an image. The image of someone who is unique, exceptional, above average. And maintaining that image requires effort. You begin to measure yourself in different ways, not just against others, but against an idea of what it means to be special. You wonder if what you are doing is enough to stand out. You question whether your life is meaningful enough. You feel subtle dissatisfaction when things feel too ordinary, because the mind has been trained to believe that ordinary is not enough. But this belief is where the deeper misunderstanding lives. Ordinary is not empty. Ordinary is not lacking. Ordinary is simply what is. It is life without distortion, without exaggeration, without the need to be elevated. But the mind does not see it that way at first. It sees ordinary as invisible, as unimportant, as something to escape. And so it keeps searching for ways to rise above it. This creates a quiet pressure. Even in moments that could be peaceful, there is a subtle sense that something more should be happening, that life should feel bigger, more significant, more noticeable, and this prevents you from fully resting in what is already here. Buddhist teachings point directly to this pattern. They describe how the ego is constantly trying to construct an identity that feels solid and meaningful. It wants to be something, not just anything, but something that stands out, something that feels important. But this effort is endless, because the moment you become something, the mind starts comparing again. Is this enough? Is this better than before? Is this recognized? Is this special enough? There is no final point, because the desire to be special is not about reaching a state. It is about maintaining an image. And maintaining an image always creates tension, because life does not stay fixed. It changes, it moves, it shifts, and any identity that depends on staying in a certain position will eventually feel unstable. This is why releasing the need to be special is not a loss. It is a return to something more natural, more grounded, more real. When you begin to let go of this need, something interesting happens. At first, there may be discomfort, a sense of emptiness, a feeling that something is missing, because the mind is no longer feeding on distinction. It is no longer trying to elevate itself. It is simply present, and presence without the noise of identity can feel unfamiliar. But if you stay with it, without trying to fill it, something begins to change. The discomfort softens. The need to stand out begins to fade, and in its place, there is a quiet ease. You begin to experience life without constantly evaluating its significance. Moments no longer need to be impressive to feel meaningful. Simple things begin to feel complete: a conversation, a breath, a quiet moment alone, a small action done with clarity. These things no longer feel insufficient. They feel whole. This is the peace of being ordinary. Not ordinary as in less, but ordinary as in complete, without the need to be more, without the need to be different, without the need to stand out. There is a deep relaxation in this, because you are no longer trying to become something. You are no longer shaping yourself to fit an image. You are simply allowing yourself to be, And in that being, there is a different kind of fullness, a fullness that does not depend on attention, a fullness that does not depend on recognition, a fullness that does not depend on comparison. It is quiet, but it is stable. You begin to see that the idea of being special was always relative. It only exists in comparison to others. Without comparison, the concept loses its meaning. There is no above or below, no better or worse. There is just what is, and what is enough. This realization changes how you move through the world. You stop trying to prove that your life is meaningful. You stop trying to make your identity impressive. You stop seeking experiences that will elevate your sense of self. Instead, you begin to engage with life directly, without needing it to confirm anything about you. This brings a sense of freedom, a freedom from the pressure to stand out, a freedom from the fear of being ordinary, a freedom from the constant effort to be more. And in that freedom, something else becomes visible. You begin to see that everyone is carrying the same struggle, the same quiet desire to be seen as special, the same fear of being unnoticed, the same effort to prove their value. And instead of feeling separate from others, you begin to feel connected, because you see the shared experience, the shared conditioning, the shared misunderstanding. This creates compassion, not because you are trying to be kind, but because you understand. You see that the need to be special is not a flaw. It is something that was learned, something that can be unlearned. And in unlearning it, you return to something simpler, something more natural, something that does not need to be elevated to feel complete. You begin to live without the constant need to define yourself, without the need to stand out, without the need to be more than you are. And this is where true peace begins, not in becoming special, but in realizing that you never needed to be, that your value was never dependent on distinction, that your existence was already complete, without addition, without decoration, without comparison, just as it is. And in that realization, something settles. The search slows down, the pressure dissolves, the need to prove fades away. And what remains is something simple, a quiet presence, a steady sense of being, a life that is not trying to become extraordinary, but is fully alive in its ordinariness. And in that ordinariness, there is nothing missing, nothing to add, nothing to remove, just completeness, unseen, unannounced, unconditional, and finally, at peace. And as the need to be special begins to dissolve, something else quietly starts to loosen its grip. A belief that has been sitting underneath almost everything you felt about yourself, a belief so common that it rarely gets questioned, the belief that value is limited, that if someone else has more, you must have less, that if someone shines, you must step back. That worth is something people compete for, fight for, struggle to earn, and protect from others. Even when you stop trying to stand out, this belief can still remain in the background. It shows up in subtle ways, a quiet comparison, a small feeling of being behind, a sense that there is not enough space for everyone to matter. And this is where another illusion begins to reveal itself. There is a quiet tension that comes from believing that value is scarce. It does not always feel like fear, but it shapes how you see the world. It makes you look at others not just as people, but as reference points. It makes you think in terms of more and less, ahead and behind, better and worse. And without realizing it, it turns life into a competition, not always an obvious one, but a silent one. You begin to feel that if someone else is praised, there is less praise available for you. If someone else succeeds, it somehow reduces your own position. If someone else is recognized, it feels like you have been overlooked. This is the myth of scarcity in value, the idea that worth is something that can run out, that it must be distributed unevenly, that it exists in limited supply. But this belief is not based on truth. It is based on misunderstanding, because value, in its true sense, is not something that can be measured in portions. It is not something that can be taken from one person and given to another. It is not something that decreases when shared. Yet the mind treats it as if it were. From early experiences, you are placed in systems that rank people, grades, awards, positions, recognition. You are taught to compete, to compare, to measure your place among others. And slowly, this creates a perception that value itself is part of that system. You begin to believe that being valuable means being above someone else, that being enough means being better, that having worth means having more than others. But this is where confusion begins, because those systems measure performance, not existence. They measure outcomes, not essence. They measure roles, not reality. And when you use those systems to define your worth, you begin to see life through a distorted lens. You start to feel that you must secure your place, that you must protect your position, that you must maintain your level. And this creates pressure. Because if value is limited, then losing your position feels like losing your worth, and gaining a position feels like gaining worth. This creates a constant sense of instability. You are always trying to hold on to something, always trying to move forward, always trying not to fall behind. And even when you succeed, the feeling does not last. Because someone else is always moving, someone else is always advancing, and the mind keeps tracking. This is exhausting, not because you are doing too much, but because you are thinking within a system that never settles, a system that always creates more comparison, more tension, more separation. Buddhist teachings challenge this belief at its core. They point out that worth is not something that exists in competition, because competition requires comparison, and comparison requires separation. But at a deeper level, there is no fixed separation between beings. There is only the illusion of it. Each person is a unique expression of conditions, experiences, and awareness. No two paths are the same. No two lives can be measured on the same scale. And when you try to do that, you create conflict where there was none. The idea that someone else's value reduces yours is based on this misunderstanding. It assumes that value is like a resource, like money or status or attention, but intrinsic worth does not function that way. It is not something you compete for, it is something you recognize, and recognition is not limited. One person realizing their worth does not prevent another from doing the same. In fact, it often makes it easier. Because when someone stops competing, they stop reinforcing the system of comparison. They stop feeding the idea that value must be earned at the expense of others. They begin to exist differently, and that difference can be felt. There is a quiet ease in someone who is not competing for worth. They do not feel threatened by others. They do not feel the need to prove themselves. They are not constantly measuring their position. They are simply present. And that presence changes how they relate to the world. They can appreciate others without feeling diminished. They can celebrate someone else's success without feeling behind. They can witness beauty, intelligence, strength, or creativity in others without turning it into a comparison, because they no longer see value as limited. This is a shift in perception, from scarcity to openness, from competition to coexistence, from measuring to understanding. When this shift begins, something inside relaxes. The constant need to secure your place begins to fade. The fear of being outshined begins to dissolve. The tension of comparison loses its intensity because you are no longer operating within the same framework. You are no longer asking, "Where do I stand?" You are simply seeing what is. This creates a different experience of life, one where other people are not obstacles, not competitors, not threats, but expressions of life moving in different directions, each with their own path, their own timing, their own unfolding. And in that understanding, there is space to be yourself without pressure, space to grow without comparison, space to exist without needing to measure your worth. You begin to notice how much energy was being used to maintain a position, to stay ahead, to avoid falling behind, to compare constantly. And when that energy is no longer needed, it becomes available for something else, for presence, for clarity, for genuine connection. Because when you are not competing, you can actually see people, not as references, not as measurements, but as individuals. And this changes how you interact. You listen more, you judge less, you connect more deeply, because you are no longer filtering everything through comparison. This also changes how you see yourself. You stop feeling like you need to justify your existence. You stop feeling like you need to prove that you deserve space. You stop feeling like you need to compete to belong. Because belonging is no longer something you earn, it is something you already have. As part of existence itself, this is where a deeper sense of peace begins to form. Not based on being better, not based on being ahead, but based on being. Simply being, without the need to measure, without the need to compare, without the need to compete. There is also a deeper insight that begins to emerge. You start to see that the idea of scarcity and value was never real. It was a projection, a way of interpreting the world shaped by systems of measurement. But those systems were never designed to define your essence. They were designed to organize external outcomes, and confusing the two creates suffering. When you separate them, clarity returns. You can still engage in the world, still pursue goals, still grow, create, and achieve, but your worth is no longer tied to those outcomes. It is not something that increases or decreases based on position. It is constant, and from that constancy, your actions become lighter, less driven by fear, less driven by competition, more aligned with what feels true. This creates a different kind of movement, not one that is racing against others, but one that is unfolding naturally, at its own pace, in its own direction, without the need to compare, without the need to compete. And in that freedom, something becomes clear. There was never a limited supply of worth. There was only a limited understanding of it. And once that understanding expands, the illusion fades. You no longer see life as a competition for value. You see it as a space where value already exists in every being, without exception, without comparison, without scarcity. And in that realization, something settles deeply. The need to compete dissolves, the fear of not being enough fades, the pressure to secure your place disappears because there was never a place to secure. There was only a truth to recognize, that your worth was never in competition. It was never something to win. It was never something to lose. It was always there, quiet, steady, unaffected, waiting to be seen. Not through comparison, but through understanding. And once you see it clearly, the entire structure of competition loses its hold. Not because you forced it to, but because it no longer makes sense. What remains is something simple. A life that is no longer measured against others, a sense of self that is no longer defined by position, a way of being that is not competing for value, but resting in it fully, naturally, without effort, without fear, without lack, just complete. And as the illusion of scarcity begins to fade, another layer quietly reveals itself, something even more subtle, even more deeply rooted. Because even when you stop competing, even when you stop measuring your worth against others, there is still a quiet habit that remains, a habit so normal that it almost feels invisible, the need to be seen, not always in loud ways, not always through attention or praise, but in small, silent expectations, the feeling that your existence somehow becomes more real when someone notices it, that your actions matter more when they are acknowledged, that your presence is somehow incomplete without a witness. And this is where a deeper question begins to rise. Who are you when no one is watching? There is a strange feeling that comes with this question. It can feel uncomfortable at first, almost like standing in an empty room where nothing reflects you back, no reactions, no feedback, no acknowledgement, just you and your own awareness. And for many people, this feels unfamiliar, because for most of their lives they have existed in relation to being seen. Their identity has been shaped, refined, and confirmed through the eyes of others. Even in moments of solitude, there is often an imagined audience, a quiet awareness of how they would be perceived if someone were watching. This is how deep the conditioning goes. The mind becomes so used to being observed that it begins to observe itself as if from the outside. It carries an invisible mirror, constantly reflecting an image of who it thinks it is. And when that mirror is removed, something feels missing. This is the subtle dependency on being witnessed. It is not just about attention, it is about existence itself. The feeling that I am seen becomes closely tied to the feeling that I am real. And without that reflection, the mind begins to feel uncertain. This creates a quiet unease. You may find yourself wanting to share moments, not because they need to be shared, but because they feel incomplete otherwise. You may notice a subtle urge to document, to express, to show, not from clarity, but from a need to confirm that what you are experiencing matters. This is not wrong, it is simply a pattern that has been reinforced over time. The more your experiences are seen, the more they feel validated. And the more they feel validated, the more the mind begins to depend on that validation. But this creates a subtle problem, because when your sense of reality depends on being observed, you begin to lose connection with direct experience. You are no longer fully in the moment. Part of you is outside of it, watching, evaluating, imagining how it appears. This divides your attention. Instead of being fully present, you are split between experiencing and observing, and this split creates a quiet tension. You may not notice it at first, but it is there. A sense of not being fully grounded, a sense of always being slightly outside yourself. And over time, this can become exhausting, because you are never fully resting in your own experience. You are always relating it to something external. Buddhist teachings point to this as a form of attachment. Not attachment to objects or outcomes, but attachment to identity as seen by others. The mind becomes attached to the idea of being someone who is noticed, acknowledged, recognized. And this attachment creates dependency. Because if your sense of self depends on being seen, then what happens when no one is looking? What happens when your actions are not acknowledged? What happens when your presence goes unnoticed? For many, this creates discomfort, a feeling of being invisible, a sense that something is missing. But this discomfort is not because something is actually missing. It is because the mind has been trained to expect reflection. It has been trained to look outward for confirmation, and when that confirmation is absent, it feels like a loss. But this is where a deeper understanding begins. Your existence does not depend on being observed. Your actions do not need acknowledgement to be real. Your presence does not require an audience to be complete. These truths may sound simple, but they carry profound implications. Because when you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You start to reconnect with your own experience, not as something to be seen, but as something to be lived. You begin to notice what it feels like to act without being watched, to speak without being heard, to exist without being acknowledged. And instead of feeling empty, something unexpected begins to emerge. A quiet fullness, a sense of completeness that does not depend on reflection. You begin to realize that the need to be seen was never about reality. It was about reassurance. The mind wanted confirmation that it mattered. But mattering is not something that comes from observation. It is something that exists independently. And when you stop seeking it externally, you begin to feel it internally. This changes how you experience solitude. It is no longer a space where you feel invisible. It becomes a space where you feel whole. Because you are no longer looking for someone else to confirm your existence. You are simply aware of it. This awareness is quiet, but it is stable. It does not rise and fall with attention. It does not depend on feedback. It is always there, and when you begin to rest in it, something inside relaxes. The need to be seen begins to soften. The urge to be acknowledged loses its intensity. You start to feel less dependent on external reflection and more grounded in your own presence. This does not mean you withdraw from the world. It means you relate to it differently. You can still share, you can still connect, you can still be seen. But it is no longer something you need to feel complete. It becomes something you enjoy, not something you depend on. This creates a different kind of freedom, a freedom from the invisible pressure to be noticed, a freedom from the subtle anxiety of being overlooked, a freedom from the constant awareness of how you are being perceived. You begin to move more naturally, more honestly, more simply, because you are no longer performing for an audience. You are just living, and in that simplicity, something becomes clear. You were never incomplete without a witness. You were only conditioned to believe that you were. This realization changes how you experience even the smallest moments. A quiet walk becomes complete on its own. A simple thought becomes enough without needing to be expressed. A moment of stillness becomes meaningful without needing to be shared. Because you are no longer using observation as a measure of value, you are simply experiencing. This also deepens your sense of presence, because when you are not dividing your attention between yourself and an imagined observer, you are fully here, fully engaged, fully aware. There is no distance, no separation, just direct experience. And this is where peace begins to deepen, not as an idea, but as a felt reality. A quiet sense of being that does not need to be confirmed. A steady awareness that does not depend on recognition. A way of existing that is complete in itself. This is what it means to have self-worth without witness. Not a forced independence, not a rejection of others, but a natural understanding that your value does not require observation, that your existence is not dependent on acknowledgement, that your presence is whole even in complete solitude. And when this understanding settles in, something profound happens. You stop needing the world to reflect you back to yourself. You begin to know yourself directly, not through reactions, not through feedback, but through awareness. And this knowing is different. It is quieter, less dramatic, but far more stable, because it does not change with circumstance. It does not fluctuate with attention. It remains constant, unshaken. And from that place, you begin to live differently, not trying to be seen, not trying to be acknowledged, not trying to confirm your existence, but simply existing, fully, completely, without the need for an audience. And in that existence, there is nothing missing, nothing lacking, nothing to prove, just a quiet, steady sense of being. That does not depend on being observed to be real. That does not depend on being acknowledged to be valuable. That simply is. And in that is, everything is already complete. And as you begin to rest in your own presence without needing to be seen, another quiet shift starts to unfold. Because even when you no longer depend on being observed, there is still something the mind holds on to very tightly, something it uses to measure its place in the world, something that quietly defines how it feels about itself, outcomes, the results, the decisions, the moments where something either goes your way or it doesn't. And this is where another misunderstanding begins to surface. There is a subtle pain that comes from not being chosen. It does not always appear as strong emotion. Sometimes it is just a small drop in energy, a quiet thought that says, maybe I am not enough, a feeling that something has been taken away from you, even when nothing truly has. And without noticing it, the mind turns outcomes into identity. It starts to believe that being selected means being worthy, that being overlooked means being lacking, that a single result has the power to define what you are. But what if this connection is not real? What if not being chosen has nothing to do with your value? There is a moment that many people know well. You put yourself forward, you try, you show up, and then the result comes back, and it is not what you hoped for. And in that moment, the mind moves quickly. It does not pause, it does not question. It immediately creates meaning. I was not picked. I was not good enough. I was rejected. But these are not the same thing. Not being chosen is an outcome. Not being good enough is a conclusion. And the mind often confuses the two. This confusion creates unnecessary suffering, because outcomes are influenced by many factors: timing, conditions, preferences, perspectives that you may never fully see. They are not pure reflections of your worth. They are simply results within a specific context. But the mind simplifies everything. It reduces complex situations into personal judgments. It takes something neutral and turns it into something deeply personal. And this is where attachment begins. Attachment to outcomes. The need for things to go a certain way in order to feel okay. The belief that a result must confirm your value. And when this attachment is strong, every outcome carries weight. Every decision feels like a statement about you. Every yes feels like validation. Every no feels like rejection. This creates a fragile state of being, because your sense of self is constantly being affected by things you cannot fully control. You begin to feel like you are at the mercy of results, like your worth rises and falls depending on what happens outside of you. This creates anxiety before outcomes, and disappointment after them, a cycle that repeats again and again. Buddhist teachings offer a different way of seeing this. They point to the nature of attachment itself. They show that suffering does not come from the outcome, but from the meaning the mind attaches to it. The event happens, and then the mind adds a story, and that story is what creates the feeling. When you begin to see this clearly, something starts to shift. You begin to separate what happened from what you think it means. You begin to notice that an outcome is just an event. It is not a definition. It is not a judgment. It is not a measure of your worth. It is simply something that occurred. And this understanding creates space. Space between you and the result. Space that allows you to respond instead of react. Because when you are fully attached to outcomes, there is no space. There is only reaction, immediate, automatic, unquestioned. But when that attachment begins to loosen, you gain something powerful: clarity. You can look at a situation and see it for what it is, without adding unnecessary meaning. You can experience a result without turning it into a reflection of yourself. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop identifying. You still act. You still try. You still move forward. But your sense of self is no longer tied to the result. And this changes everything. Because when you are not attached to outcomes, you are free to act fully, without fear of what it will say about you, without hesitation based on possible rejection, without the constant need for validation. You become more present in your actions, more focused, more grounded, because you are not distracted by what might happen. You are simply engaged in what is happening. This also changes how you experience disappointment, because disappointment often comes from expectation, from a fixed idea of how things should unfold. And when reality does not match that idea, the mind resists. It feels like something has gone wrong. But when you are less attached to outcomes, that resistance softens. You still notice the difference between what you hoped for and what occurred. But you do not collapse into it. You do not turn it into a personal failure. You simply see it. And in that seeing, there is acceptance. Not passive acceptance, but clear acceptance. An understanding that what happened, happened, and that it does not define you. This allows you to move forward more easily, without carrying unnecessary weight, without holding on to the past, without replaying moments and questioning your worth. You begin to trust something deeper, not outcomes, but your own presence, your ability to act, to respond, to continue, regardless of results. This creates resilience, not the kind that forces strength, but the kind that comes from understanding, from knowing that your value is not at risk, that it cannot be taken away by a single decision, or a series of decisions, or even repeated outcomes, because it was never dependent on them. There is also a deeper freedom that comes with this, a freedom from the fear of rejection. Because when you no longer equate not being chosen with being rejected, the fear loses its power. You begin to see that what you called rejection was often just redirection, a movement away from something that was not aligned, a shift in direction that you could not fully understand at the time. And when you look back, you may begin to notice this pattern. Moments that felt like loss, but later revealed themselves as necessary changes. Situations that did not work out, but created space for something else. Paths that closed, but led you somewhere unexpected. This does not mean every outcome has a clear purpose, but it shows that the meaning you assign in the moment is not always accurate. And when you hold that lightly, you suffer less. You allow life to unfold without needing to control every result. You trust the process more, not blindly, but with awareness. Understanding that outcomes are part of a larger flow, not isolated judgments of your worth. This also changes how you approach effort. You no longer act only for the result. You act because the action itself matters, because it is aligned, because it feels true. And this brings a different kind of satisfaction, one that is not dependent on what happens next, but on the integrity of what you are doing now. This is where a deeper sense of stability begins to form, a stability that is not shaken by success or failure, by being chosen or not being chosen. Because your sense of self is no longer tied to those things, it is grounded in something more constant, something that does not change with circumstances. And from that place, you begin to experience life differently, less as a series of tests, and more as a series of experiences, each one offering something, not always what you expected, but something. And when you are not attached to specific outcomes, you are more open to what is actually present. You see opportunities where you might have seen loss. You notice growth where you might have seen failure. You recognize movement where you might have felt stuck, because you are no longer filtering everything through a fixed expectation. You are simply observing, responding, continuing. This creates a sense of flow, a way of moving through life that is less rigid, less controlled, more adaptive, more aware, and within that flow there is less resistance, less struggle, less unnecessary suffering, because you are not constantly pushing against what is. You are working with it, understanding it, moving through it, and in that movement something becomes clear. Not being chosen was never the problem. The problem was what you believed it meant, and once that belief is seen clearly, it begins to lose its hold. You no longer see outcomes as definitions, you see them as events. You no longer see results as reflections of your worth. You see them as part of a larger process. And in that understanding, something settles. A quiet confidence, not based on success, not dependent on approval, but rooted in clarity, in awareness, in the simple knowing that your value does not rise and fall with what happens outside of you. And from that knowing, you begin to live more freely, not waiting to be chosen, not fearing rejection, not attaching your identity to outcomes, but simply acting, experiencing, continuing, with a sense of ease, a sense of steadiness, a sense of being that remains, regardless of the result. And in that steadiness, there is peace. Not because everything goes your way, but because you no longer need it to. You understand that not being chosen does not mean you were rejected. It simply means that moment moved differently than expected. And you are still here, still whole, still complete, still valuable, exactly as you are. And as you begin to loosen your attachment to outcomes, something even deeper begins to come into focus. Because if not being chosen does not define you, then another question naturally rises beneath it. A question that quietly challenges something you may have believed for a long time. Who gave others the authority to decide your value? There is a subtle weight that comes from believing that someone else's opinion can define you. It is not always loud. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation, a pause before you act, a second thought before you speak, a quiet need to check how something will be received before you allow yourself to fully express it. And this is where another illusion begins to reveal itself. There is a feeling that someone out there knows better, that they can see something about you that you cannot see for yourself, that their approval carries more truth than your own awareness. And without realizing it, you begin to give that belief power. You begin to treat certain voices as authority, not just in practical matters, but in something far deeper, your sense of worth. And once that happens, your inner stability begins to shift. Because if someone else can define your value, then your value is no longer yours. It becomes something external, something that can be given or taken away. This creates a quiet dependency. You begin to look outward for confirmation. You begin to measure yourself through reactions. You begin to adjust who you are based on how you are received. And slowly, without noticing it, you move further away from yourself. There is a strange pattern that forms here. You trust others to define you, even when they cannot fully see you, even when they only know a small part of your life, even when their judgments are based on limited information. Because the mind has been conditioned to believe that authority exists outside, that someone else must know more, that someone else must decide. But when it comes to your worth, this belief creates confusion. Because worth is not something that can be accurately judged from the outside. It is not something that can be measured through observation alone. It is not something that can be defined by opinion. Yet, the mind often treats it as if it can. You may notice this in small moments. A compliment that lifts your mood more than expected. A criticism that stays with you longer than it should. A single opinion that shapes how you see yourself for days. These reactions are not random. They come from the belief that others have authority over your value. And when that belief is strong, every opinion feels important, every reaction feels meaningful, every judgment feels personal. But this is where clarity begins, because when you look closely, you start to see something important. Other people's views are shaped by their own experiences, their own beliefs, their own perceptions. They are not neutral, they are not complete, they are interpretations. And interpretations are not truth. This does not mean others are always wrong. It means they are limited, just as you are, just as everyone is. No one has access to your full experience. No one sees your entire journey. No one understands every layer of what makes you who you are. And because of this, no one can fully define your value. Yet the mind often forgets this. It hears an opinion and treats it as fact. It receives feedback and turns it into identity. It takes something external and internalizes it as truth. This is how the illusion of authority forms, not because others truly have power over your worth, but because the mind gives it to them. And once that power is given, it begins to influence everything. How you see yourself, how you behave, how you feel. You may start to hold back parts of yourself, not because they are wrong, but because they were not accepted before. You may begin to shape your actions based on expected reactions. Not because it feels true, but because it feels safer. And over time, this creates distance. Distance between who you are and how you express yourself. Distance between your inner sense of self and your outward behavior. And this distance creates discomfort, because something inside you knows. It knows when you are not being fully aligned. It knows when you are adjusting to fit external expectations. And even if everything looks fine on the surface, there is a quiet tension underneath. This tension is not a problem. It is a signal that something is out of balance, that your sense of authority has shifted outward, that your value has been placed in the hands of others. But this can change, not through force, not through rejection of others, but through understanding, through seeing clearly where authority truly lies. Buddhist teachings point to this in a simple but profound way. They show that your experience is direct, immediate, known from within, and this direct knowing is something no one else can access in the same way. Others can observe, they can interpret, they can respond, but they cannot be inside your awareness. They cannot fully know what you know, and because of this, their ability to define your value is limited. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You start to question the weight you have given to external opinions. You begin to notice how quickly you have accepted them as truth, and you begin to create space. Space to observe without immediately internalizing, space to listen without losing your center, space to receive feedback without turning it into identity. This space is important because it allows you to respond differently. Instead of absorbing everything, you begin to filter, not through defensiveness, but through awareness. You ask yourself, is this true? Not in a reactive way, but in a grounded way. And sometimes the answer will be yes. Sometimes feedback will be useful. Sometimes it will point to something real. But even then, it does not define your worth. It simply informs your growth. This distinction is important because growth is flexible. It evolves, it changes, but worth is constant. It is not something that increases or decreases based on opinion. It is something that remains, and when you begin to separate these two, your relationship with others changes. You no longer see them as judges. You see them as perspectives. You no longer feel controlled by their views. You feel informed by them when useful, and free from them when not. This creates a different kind of confidence, not loud, not defensive, but steady. A confidence that comes from knowing where your value comes from, not from approval, not from recognition, not from external authority, but from within. This does not mean you ignore others. It means you no longer depend on them to define you. You can listen without losing yourself. You can receive without attaching. You can interact without being shaped by every opinion. And this allows you to be more authentic, more aligned, more grounded, because you are no longer constantly adjusting. You are simply expressing, and in that expression there is clarity. You begin to see yourself more directly, not through reflection, not through reaction, but through awareness. And this awareness becomes your reference point, your sense of authority, not in a controlling way, but in a stable way, a way that allows you to trust your own experience, your own understanding, your own presence. And from that place, something important becomes clear. No one has the power to declare your value. They can share their views, they can offer their perspectives, but they cannot define what you are. Because what you are is not something that exists in their perception. It exists in your own awareness. And when you begin to rest in that awareness, something changes. You feel less shaken by opinions, less affected by judgment, less dependent on approval. Not because you reject others, but because you understand the limits of their authority. You see clearly that their role is not to define you, and in that clarity, there is freedom. A freedom to be yourself without constant adjustment, a freedom to act without seeking permission, a freedom to exist without needing validation. And this freedom is quiet. It does not need to be announced. It does not need to be proven. It is simply felt, in the way you move, in the way you speak, in the way you relate to yourself. And over time, this changes how you experience everything, because you are no longer looking outward for definition. You are resting inward, in a place that is not easily shaken, a place that does not depend on others, a place that is steady, and in that steadiness, something becomes undeniable. Your value was never theirs to define. It was never in their hands. It was never something they could give or take away. It was always yours, quietly present, unchanged, waiting to be recognized, not by others, but by you. And as you begin to take back the authority you once gave to others, something else starts to become visible. Because if no one has the power to declare your value, then another structure begins to lose its weight, a structure that has quietly shaped how you see yourself and everyone around you. The idea of status, the sense that some people are above and others are below, that some lives matter more, carry more weight, deserve more attention, that there is an invisible ladder and everyone is placed somewhere on it. And without even noticing it, the mind has been climbing or comparing or fearing where it stands. But what if this ladder is not real? There is a strange tension that exists when you believe in status. It is not always obvious, but it is always there. A subtle awareness of position, a quiet checking of where you fit, a constant measuring, even in moments where nothing needs to be measured. You walk into a room and something inside begins to scan. Who is more important? Who has more influence? Where do I stand in relation to them? And this process happens quickly, often without words, but it shapes how you feel. If you perceive yourself as lower, there may be hesitation, a slight shrinking, a carefulness in how you speak. If you perceive yourself as higher, there may be subtle pride, a sense of being more certain, more confident, more entitled to space. And in both cases, something is lost, because you are no longer simply present, you are positioned. This positioning creates distance, distance between you and others, distance between you and yourself. Because you are no longer relating directly, you are relating through a structure, a mental map that divides people into levels. But this structure is not as solid as it seems. It is not something you can touch. It is not something that exists outside of perception. It is a construction of the mind, built from ideas, reinforced by systems, repeated through culture, but still a construction. From a young age, you are introduced to hierarchy: who performs better, who leads, who follows, who is praised, who is overlooked, and slowly, these patterns begin to form a belief that people exist on different levels of worth, that some are inherently more valuable, that some deserve more recognition. And this belief becomes so familiar that it feels natural. It feels like reality. But when you look more closely, you begin to see something different. Status is not fixed. It changes depending on context. Someone who is highly respected in one environment may be unknown in another. Someone who holds power in one space may have none in a different setting. What is considered high in one culture may not even be recognized in another. This inconsistency reveals something important. If status were real in an absolute sense, it would not change. But it does, constantly, which means it is not an inherent quality. It is a perception, a shared agreement, a mental framework. And once you begin to see it this way, its hold begins to weaken. You start to notice how often your mind is referencing this invisible ladder, how it affects your posture, your tone, your confidence, your sense of self. And as you notice it, you begin to question it. You begin to ask, is this real? Not the roles people play, not the responsibilities they hold, but the idea that their value is greater or lesser because of it. And in that questioning, something begins to shift. You start to see people differently, not as positions, not as levels, but as individuals, each with their own experiences, their own struggles, their own awareness. You begin to see that behind every role there is a person, and that person is not defined by the role. They are simply expressing it. This changes how you relate. You feel less intimidated, less impressed, less influenced by external markers. Because you are no longer seeing through the lens of hierarchy, you are seeing directly. And this direct seeing creates equality. Not in the sense that everyone is the same, but in the sense that everyone shares the same fundamental nature, the same presence, the same awareness,
This is what Buddhist teachings point to. They do not deny that differences exist, but they show that these differences do not define intrinsic worth. They are surface level, contextual, temporary. What is deeper is the same. And when you begin to rest in that understanding, something changes inside you. The need to climb begins to fade. The fear of being lower begins to dissolve. The desire to be above begins to lose its appeal, because you see that the entire structure was based on perception, not reality. This does not mean you stop participating in the world. You can still take on roles. You can still lead, follow, create, contribute. But you are no longer attaching your identity to position. You are no longer using status as a measure of self. And this brings a different kind of freedom. A freedom from comparison, a freedom from pressure, a freedom from the constant need to evaluate where you stand. You begin to move more naturally, more honestly, because you are not adjusting yourself based on perceived levels. You are simply expressing what is true. This also changes how you experience others. You feel less need to impress, less need to compete, less need to prove anything, because there is no ladder to climb, no position to secure, no level to maintain. There is just interaction, human to human, presence to presence. And in that interaction, something deeper becomes possible. Connection, real connection, not based on roles, not influenced by status, but grounded in mutual awareness. You begin to listen differently, not through the filter of who someone is supposed to be, but through direct attention. You begin to speak differently, not trying to position yourself, but simply expressing. And this creates a sense of ease, a sense of openness, a sense of being that is not restricted by invisible structures. At the same time, you begin to notice how often society reinforces these ideas, how status is displayed, highlighted, rewarded, how it is used to shape perception, to influence behavior, to maintain certain dynamics. And you see that this system continues because people believe in it, because they give it meaning, because they measure themselves through it. But when you no longer fully believe in it, you begin to step outside of it, not physically, but mentally. And this changes everything. You can still navigate the world, but you are not defined by it. You are not controlled by it. You are not limited by it. You see it for what it is, a structure, a framework, a shared idea, but not a truth about your worth. This understanding also brings compassion, because you begin to see how much pressure people carry, trying to maintain their position, trying to rise higher, trying to avoid falling. You see the effort, the stress, the constant evaluation. And instead of judging, you understand, because you recognize the pattern, and you see how it can be released, not through force, but through clarity, through seeing that the ladder was never solid, that the levels were never fixed, that the positions were never defining. And in that seeing, something softens inside you and in how you relate to others. You begin to meet people where they are, without placing them above or below, without creating distance, without attaching meaning to status. And this creates a different kind of presence, one that is grounded, stable, unshaken by external structures, because it is rooted in something deeper, something that does not change with roles, or titles, or recognition, something that is constant. And in that constancy, there is peace, not the kind that comes from being at the top, but the kind that comes from stepping off the ladder entirely, from no longer needing to climb, from no longer needing to compare, from no longer needing to measure, just being, fully, without position, without hierarchy, without the illusion of status. And in that being, something becomes clear. You were never above, you were never below, you were only placed there by a system of thought. And once that system is seen clearly, it begins to dissolve. What remains is simple, direct, uncomplicated, a sense of self that is not defined by where you stand, but by the fact that you are, and that is enough, completely,
without condition, without comparison, without rank, just present, just aware, just whole, and as the illusion of hierarchy begins to dissolve, something else quietly loses its grip, because if there is no ladder to climb, no position to secure, then another question naturally rises beneath it. A question that changes everything once it is seen clearly. Why have you been waiting for permission to be yourself? There is a quiet hesitation that lives in many people. It does not always speak loudly, but it shapes how they move. A pause before they express a thought. A second guess before they follow what feels true. A subtle checking of whether it is okay to be who they are in that moment. And this hesitation often feels normal. It feels responsible. It feels careful. But beneath it, there is something deeper. A belief that your existence needs approval. That your expression must be accepted before it can be real. That your truth must be validated before it can be lived. And this is where another layer of conditioning begins to reveal itself. There is a strange pattern in how the mind learns to operate. From early on, it is taught to look outward before acting, to wait for signals, to read reactions, to adjust based on feedback. And slowly, this creates a habit. A habit of seeking permission, not always directly, but in subtle ways, through hesitation, through overthinking, through the constant awareness of how something might be received. And over time, this habit becomes so familiar that it feels like part of who you are. But it is not who you are. It is something you learned. And what is learned can be seen clearly. There is a quiet cost to living this way. Because when you wait for approval, you delay your own expression. You hold back parts of yourself. You filter what you say, what you do, how you move. Not based on what is true, but based on what will be accepted. And this creates distance. Distance between your inner experience and your outer life. You begin to feel like you are not fully showing up, like something is being held back. And even when everything looks fine on the surface, there is a quiet sense of incompleteness, because something inside you knows. It knows when you are not being fully honest, not in words, but in presence. It knows when you are adjusting to fit expectations. And this awareness creates tension, a subtle discomfort that does not always have a clear source. But it is there. This tension is not a problem. It is a signal that something within you is ready to be expressed without restriction, that something is ready to move freely, but the habit of seeking approval holds it back. Because approval feels safe. It feels like protection, like if others accept you, you will not be rejected. You will not be judged. You will not be excluded. And so the mind clings to it. But this safety comes at a cost. The cost of authenticity, the cost of freedom, the cost of fully being who you are, because when your expression depends on approval, it is no longer yours. It becomes shaped by others, adjusted, filtered, controlled, and over time, this can lead to a loss of clarity. You begin to forget what feels true to you, because you are always referencing something external. You are always checking, always adjusting, always waiting. And this waiting becomes a pattern, a quiet delay in your own life. But something changes when you begin to question this pattern, when you begin to ask, what if I did not need permission? At first, this question may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because the mind is used to operating within certain boundaries. It is used to checking, to confirming, to seeking validation, and stepping outside of that feels uncertain. But within that uncertainty, there is also something else. Space. Space to explore, space to act, space to be, without needing to justify it. This is where freedom begins, not as something dramatic, but as something quiet. A small shift in how you relate to yourself. You begin to notice moments where you would normally hesitate, and instead of stopping, you allow yourself to move. You speak without overthinking. You act without waiting. You express without filtering, not in a reckless way, but in an honest way. And in these moments, something becomes clear. You did not need permission. You were only used to asking for it. This realization is subtle, but it is powerful, because it changes how you see yourself. You begin to trust your own experience more, your own instincts, your own sense of what feels right. Not because you are certain about everything, but because you are no longer dependent on external confirmation. This creates a different kind of confidence, not based on approval, but based on presence, a sense of being that is steady, that does not need to be validated to be real. And as this confidence grows, the need for approval begins to fade. You still notice others, you still listen, you still care, but you are no longer controlled by their reactions. You are no longer waiting for their permission. You are simply living. This changes how you experience fear, because much of fear is tied to how you will be perceived, to what others will think, to whether you will be accepted. But when you are no longer seeking approval, this fear loses its intensity. You may still feel it, but it does not stop you, because you are not measuring your actions through the lens of acceptance. You are acting from within, and this creates a sense of freedom. A freedom that is not dependent on circumstances, a freedom that is not granted by others, but one that comes from releasing the need for permission. You begin to move through life differently, more directly, more honestly, more fully, because you are no longer holding back. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer asking. This also changes how you relate to rejection, because when you are not seeking approval, rejection is no longer a threat. It is simply a response, one perspective among many. And it does not define you. It does not limit you. It does not stop you from being who you are. This creates resilience, not through force, but through clarity, through understanding that your existence is not something that needs to be approved. It is already valid, already real, already complete. And from that understanding, something deeper begins to settle. A quiet sense of ease, a feeling that you can simply be, without needing to explain, without needing to justify, without needing to be accepted. This ease is not passive, it is active in its own way. It allows you to engage more fully, to express more clearly, to live more honestly, because you are no longer divided between what you feel and what is allowed. There is alignment, and in that alignment, there is strength, a strength that does not come from control, but from authenticity, from being fully present in your own experience, without waiting for permission. This also deepens your connection to yourself, because when you stop looking outward for approval, your attention returns inward. You begin to notice your own thoughts more clearly, your own feelings, your own sense of direction, and this awareness becomes your guide. Not in a rigid way, but in a natural way. You begin to trust yourself, not because you are always right, but because you are no longer disconnected. You are present, and from that presence, your actions become more aligned, more genuine, more true. And over time, this creates a life that feels different, not perfect, but real, not controlled, but honest, not dependent, but free. And within that freedom, something becomes clear. You were never meant to wait. You were never meant to ask. You were never meant to filter your existence through approval. You were only taught to. And once you see that clearly, the pattern begins to loosen. You begin to step out of it, not all at once, but gradually, moment by moment, choice by choice, until one day it no longer feels natural to wait for permission. It feels natural to simply be, to act, to express, to live, without needing approval. And in that way of living, something shifts deeply. You no longer feel like you are trying to exist. You are just existing, fully, completely, without hesitation, without holding back, without asking. And in that existence, there is nothing missing, nothing lacking, nothing to prove, just a quiet, steady presence. That does not need permission to be real. That does not need approval to be valid. That simply is, free, unrestricted, whole. And as you begin to live without waiting for approval, another layer quietly comes into view.
Because even when you stop asking for permission, there can still be a subtle pattern running underneath your actions, a pattern that does not always look obvious, but quietly shapes how you show up. The desire to be chosen, not in loud ways, not always through direct effort, but in small adjustments, in the tone of your voice, in the way you present yourself, in the things you say, and the things you hold back. A quiet hope that someone, somewhere, will look at you and say, yes, you. And this is where another identity begins to reveal itself. There is a version of you that learned to be liked, a version that learned to be accepted, a version that became very skilled at reading the room, adjusting, adapting, shaping itself into what would be approved. And over time, this version became familiar. It became automatic. It became normal. But beneath it, there is something deeper. A quiet question that has been guiding many of your choices without you even noticing. What do I need to be chosen? This question can shape everything. It can influence how you speak, how you act, how you relate to others. It can make you soften your opinions, hide parts of yourself, emphasize what will be accepted, and downplay what might not be. And often it does this so subtly that it feels natural. But it is not natural. It is learned. It is a response, a way of navigating the world that was built over time. And while it may have helped you feel safe or accepted in the past, it creates a quiet cost in the present. Because when you are trying to be chosen, you are not fully choosing yourself. You are placing your attention outward, waiting, adjusting, hoping, and in that process, something gets lost. Your clarity, your authenticity, your direct connection to what is true for you. There is a tension that comes with this identity, a subtle pressure to maintain a certain image, to continue being what has been accepted before, to avoid stepping outside of that. Because stepping outside of it feels risky. It feels like you might lose approval, like you might not be chosen. And so the pattern continues. You keep adjusting, keep shaping, keep presenting a version of yourself that feels more acceptable. And over time, this becomes exhausting, not always in an obvious way, but in a quiet underlying way, because you are constantly monitoring, constantly evaluating, constantly trying to align yourself with external expectations, and this creates a split between who you are and who you think you need to be, and that split creates discomfort. Because something inside you knows. It knows when you are not being fully honest. It knows when you are performing, even in subtle ways. And that awareness creates a quiet unease. This unease is not something to avoid. It is something to understand, because it is pointing to the presence of this identity, the pick-me identity, the part of you that is still seeking validation, still hoping to be selected, still measuring itself through the eyes of others. But when you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You begin to notice the small behaviors, the subtle ways you adjust, the moments where you hesitate, the times when you say something not because it is true, but because it will be liked. And in noticing, there is awareness, and in awareness there is choice. You begin to see that these behaviors are not who you are. They are patterns, patterns that can be understood, patterns that can be released, not through force, but through clarity. Because once you see them clearly, they begin to lose their hold. You no longer act from them automatically. You begin to pause, to question, to ask yourself, is this coming from truth or from the desire to be chosen? And this question changes everything, because it brings your attention back to yourself, back to your own experience, back to what feels real. And from that place, your actions begin to shift. You speak more honestly, not in a harsh way, but in a clear way. You express what you feel, not what you think will be accepted. You allow yourself to be seen as you are, not as you think you need to be, and this can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because the mind is used to adjusting, used to seeking approval, used to shaping itself. But as you continue, something begins to change. You start to feel more grounded,
more aligned, more connected to yourself. Because you are no longer divided, you are no longer performing, you are simply being. And in that being, there is a different kind of confidence, not based on how others respond, but based on the fact that you are not hiding, that you are not filtering yourself to fit expectations, that you are not waiting to be chosen. This confidence is quiet, but it is strong, because it is rooted in authenticity. And authenticity does not need validation. It stands on its own. This also changes how you experience relationships, because when you are no longer trying to be chosen, you are no longer approaching others from a place of need. You are not trying to earn their approval. You are not trying to fit into their expectations. You are simply meeting them as you are. And this creates a different dynamic, one that is more balanced, more honest, more real, because there is no underlying agenda, no quiet attempt to be selected, just presence. And from that presence, connection becomes clearer. You can see who resonates with you, who understands you, who aligns with you, without needing to adjust yourself to fit. And this brings a different kind of clarity, because you are no longer trying to be accepted by everyone. You are simply allowing the right connections to form naturally. This also reduces a lot of unnecessary effort, because trying to be chosen requires constant energy, constant adjustment, constant awareness of how you are being perceived. But when you release that, your energy returns to you. You are no longer spending it on maintaining an image. You are using it to live, to experience, to create. And this creates a sense of ease, a sense of flow, because you are no longer forcing yourself into a shape. You are simply allowing yourself to be as you are. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to emerge. You start to see that being chosen was never the goal. It was just a conditioned desire, a pattern that was learned. And once that pattern is seen clearly, it no longer feels necessary. You no longer need to be selected to feel valuable. You no longer need to be approved to feel real. You no longer need to be chosen to feel complete, because you already are. This realization is not something you force. It is something you recognize, something that becomes obvious when the patterns fall away. And as this recognition deepens, the identity begins to dissolve. Not all at once, but gradually, moment by moment, choice by choice. You begin to act from a different place, a place that is not seeking, not waiting, not hoping, but simply being. And in that being, something settles, a quiet sense of self, a steady presence, a feeling that does not depend on external validation. And from that place, you move differently, you speak differently, you relate differently. Because you are no longer trying to be chosen, you are choosing yourself. And that changes everything. Because once you choose yourself, the need for others to do it disappears. Not because you reject them, but because you no longer depend on them. You are complete as you are, whole as you are, enough as you are. And in that understanding, the entire pattern begins to fade. The need to adjust, the need to perform, the need to seek validation, all of it begins to loosen, because it is no longer supported by belief. It is no longer reinforced by habit. It is simply seen for what it is, a pattern that once served a purpose but is no longer needed. And when that is clear, something becomes simple. You no longer ask to be chosen. You no longer try to be picked. You no longer shape yourself to fit. You just are, fully, openly, honestly, without the need for validation, without the need for approval, without the need for selection. And in that way of being, there is freedom. Not because you gained something new, but because you stopped chasing something that was never required, and what remains is something quiet, something steady, something real, a sense of self that does not depend on being chosen, because it has already chosen itself. And as the need to be chosen begins to fall away, something quiet starts to take its place. Because when you are no longer looking outward for validation, your attention naturally returns to where it has always belonged.
not to the opinions of others, not to reactions, not to approval, but to yourself. And in that return, another question begins to rise. If no one else needs to define you, can you finally see yourself clearly? There is a subtle shift that happens here. It is not loud, and it does not demand attention, but it changes everything. Because for so long, you may have known yourself through reflections, through how others responded to you, through what was accepted, what was praised, what was rejected. And slowly, those reflections became your mirror. You learned to see yourself through them. You learned to measure yourself through them. You learned to understand who you are based on what was given back to you. But now, as that pattern begins to loosen, something unfamiliar appears. There is no mirror, no constant reflection, just you and your own awareness. And this can feel strange at first, because the mind is used to confirmation, used to feedback, used to knowing itself through external signals. But without those signals, there is a quiet space, a space where something deeper can begin to emerge. Self-recognition, not as an idea, not as a concept, but as a direct experience. There is a difference between knowing yourself through others and seeing yourself directly. When you rely on others, your understanding is always filtered, always partial, always shaped by perception. But when you begin to look inward, without distortion, something changes. You begin to notice what is actually there, not what should be there, not what is expected, but what is real. This requires honesty, a kind of honesty that is not harsh but clear. You begin to see your thoughts as they are, your patterns, your reactions, your tendencies, not with judgment, but with awareness. And in that awareness, there is clarity. You start to recognize how your mind moves, how it holds onto certain ideas, how it avoids others, how it reacts to situations. And this recognition is powerful because it is direct. It is not based on opinion. It is not shaped by approval. It is simply seen. This is where true understanding begins, not from what others say about you, but from what you observe within yourself. And as this observation deepens, something else begins to shift. You start to see yourself with less distortion, less exaggeration, less comparison. You are no longer trying to be more than you are, and you are no longer reducing yourself to less than you are. You are simply seeing clearly. And this clarity brings a different kind of stability because it is not dependent on external factors. It is grounded in direct awareness. You begin to trust what you see, not blindly, but with quiet confidence, because it is not based on assumption. It is based on observation. This creates a different relationship with yourself, one that is not based on judgment, not based on evaluation, but based on understanding. You begin to meet yourself where you are, without needing to change immediately, without needing to fix everything, just seeing. And in that seeing there is acceptance, not passive acceptance, but clear acceptance, an acknowledgement of what is present. And from that place, something begins to grow, a sense of self that is not constructed, not dependent, not shaped by others, but rooted in awareness. This is the quiet power of self-recognition. It does not seek attention. It does not need validation. It does not announce itself. But it changes how you move through the world, because you are no longer uncertain about who you are. You are no longer waiting for confirmation. You are no longer searching for reflection. You are simply aware. And this awareness becomes your foundation. From it, your actions begin to align. Your words become clearer. Your decisions become more grounded, because they are not based on external influence. They are based on direct understanding. This also changes how you experience doubt, because doubt often comes from uncertainty, from not knowing where you stand, from relying on others to define you. But when you begin to see yourself clearly, that uncertainty begins to fade, not completely, but significantly.
You may still question things, but those questions do not shake your core, because your core is no longer based on shifting opinions. It is based on steady awareness. This creates resilience, a quiet strength that does not need to prove itself, because it is not built on comparison, it is built on clarity. You begin to notice that you are less affected by external reactions, not because you ignore them, but because they no longer define you. You can receive feedback without losing your center. You can hear opinions without becoming them. You can experience praise without attaching to it, and criticism without collapsing into it, because your reference point has changed. It is no longer outside, it is within. This also brings a deeper sense of peace, because when you are not constantly looking outward, the mind becomes quieter, less reactive, less distracted, more settled. You are no longer pulled in different directions by external input. You are grounded, present, aware, and in that presence, something becomes simple. You begin to live from yourself, not from reflection. You act because it feels true, not because it will be approved. You speak because it is clear, not because it will be accepted. You move because it aligns, not because it will be noticed. And this creates a life that feels more real, more direct, more honest, because it is not filtered through external expectation. It is expressed from within. There is also a deeper compassion that emerges here, because as you begin to see yourself clearly, you also begin to see others more clearly. You recognize that they too are shaped by patterns, by conditioning, by perception. And this understanding softens judgment. It creates space. Because you are no longer seeing people through fixed ideas. You are seeing them as they are, in process, in movement, just like you. And this shared understanding creates connection, not based on roles, not based on status, but based on awareness, on presence, on being. This connection is different. It is not dependent on validation. It is not based on approval. It is simply there, because you are no longer trying to be seen. You are simply seeing, and in that seeing, something becomes clear. You were never meant to rely on others to know yourself. They can reflect parts of you. They can offer perspectives, but they cannot replace your own awareness. And when you begin to trust that awareness, everything shifts. You stop searching for yourself in others. You stop defining yourself through reactions. You stop waiting for confirmation, because you already see. And in that seeing, there is a quiet completeness, a sense that you are not missing anything. Not because you are perfect, but because you are present, fully aware of what is, without distortion, without avoidance, without need. This is not something that happens all at once. It unfolds, gradually, through attention, through honesty, through awareness. And as it unfolds, it becomes more natural, more stable, more consistent, until one day you no longer question it. You no longer look outward first. You no longer need reflection to feel real. You simply know, not in a rigid way, but in a clear way, a grounded way, a quiet way. And from that knowing, you begin to live differently, with less confusion, less doubt, less dependency, because you are no longer searching for yourself. You are recognizing yourself, and that recognition is enough. It does not need to be confirmed. It does not need to be validated. It does not need to be seen by others. It is already complete, within you, always, unchanging. And in that realization, something settles deeply. A sense of peace, a sense of clarity, a sense of being that does not need to be defined, because it is already known, fully, quietly, clearly, by you. And as you begin to see yourself clearly, without needing reflection, without needing to be chosen, something else begins to loosen its grip. Because even with all this clarity, there can still be one experience that quietly shakes the mind more than expected. Rejection, not always loud, not always dramatic, but subtle, sharp, and deeply personal when it happens. A moment where you are overlooked, not selected, not acknowledged, and something inside you reacts. A quiet question forms almost instantly.
What does this say about me? And this is where another illusion begins to reveal itself. There is a feeling that rejection carries truth, that it reveals something real about your worth, that it exposes a lack, a flaw, something missing. And because of this, the mind gives it weight. It replays the moment. It analyzes what went wrong. It tries to find meaning. But what if rejection does not mean what you think it means? There is a tendency to take a single outcome and turn it into a conclusion, to take one moment of being overlooked and expand it into a larger story, a story about who you are, what you deserve, where you stand. But this expansion is not reality. It is interpretation. Rejection, in its simplest form, is just an event. A situation where something did not align. A moment where a decision moved in a different direction. That is all. But the mind does not leave it there. It adds meaning. It personalizes. It turns a neutral event into a reflection of identity. And this is where the pain comes from. Not from the rejection itself, but from what you believe it says about you. You begin to feel that you were not enough, that you were not wanted, that you were somehow lacking. But these are conclusions, not facts. They are stories built on limited information. Because in any moment of rejection, there are countless factors at play. Timing, context, preferences, perspectives, conditions you may never fully understand. And yet, the mind simplifies all of that into one idea. It is about me. This is the illusion, the assumption that everything revolves around your worth. But most of the time, it does not. Most of the time, it is simply a matter of alignment, or lack of it. A situation where what you offered did not match what was needed. Not because it was less, but because it was different, and difference is not deficiency. But the mind often treats it that way because it has been conditioned to connect acceptance with value and rejection with lack. But this connection is not real, it is learned. And what is learned can be unlearned. When you begin to look at rejection without immediately adding meaning, something changes. You begin to see it more clearly, more simply, as an event, not a definition. And in that clarity, the emotional weight begins to soften. You may still feel disappointment, that is natural, but the deeper pain, the feeling of being less, of being unworthy, begins to fade. Because you are no longer attaching that meaning to the experience. This creates space. Space to respond instead of react. Space to observe instead of assume. Space to understand instead of judge. And within that space, something important becomes visible. You begin to see how often rejection has been misunderstood. How many times you took something personally that was never personal. How many times you created a story that was never true. And this realization can be both surprising and freeing, because it shows you that the pain was not coming from reality, it was coming from interpretation. And once you see that, you begin to question those interpretations. You begin to ask, is this really about me? And often the answer is no, or at least not in the way you thought. This does not mean you avoid responsibility. It does not mean you ignore feedback or refuse to grow. It simply means you stop turning every outcome into a judgment of your worth. You separate what happened from what you believe it means. And this separation is powerful because it allows you to learn without collapsing, to grow without feeling diminished, to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. You begin to see that rejection does not take anything from you. It does not reduce your value. It does not define your reality. It simply redirects your path. And sometimes that redirection is not immediately clear. It may feel confusing, uncomfortable, even unfair. But over time, you may begin to notice something, that what did not work out created space for something else, something that aligned more closely. Something that made more sense, something that you could not have seen before. This does not mean every rejection leads to something better in a simple way, but it shows that rejection is not the end. It is a shift, a movement, part of a larger process that is not always visible in the moment. And when you understand this, your relationship with rejection begins to change. You stop fearing it as much. You stop avoiding it. You stop seeing it as something that threatens your identity. Instead, you begin to see it as information, as direction, as part of how life unfolds. This creates a different kind of confidence, not the kind that expects everything to go your way, but the kind that knows you will remain whole regardless of what happens. Because your worth is no longer tied to outcomes or decisions or other people's responses. It is steady, unchanged, independent. And from that place, you begin to approach life differently. You are more willing to try, more open to experience, less afraid of what might happen, because you are no longer attaching your identity to the result. You are simply engaging, and this engagement is free from the pressure to be accepted, free from the fear of being rejected, free from the constant need to protect your sense of self. You begin to move with more ease, more openness, more presence, because you are not carrying the weight of interpretation. You are simply experiencing what is. And in that experience, something becomes clear. Rejection was never empty. It only felt that way because of the meaning you gave it, but in itself, it carries no inherent judgment, no fixed truth, no statement about your worth. It is just a moment, a shift, a direction. And when you see it that way, its power begins to dissolve, not because you avoid it, but because you understand it. You see through it. You recognize that being overlooked does not define reality. It only defines a moment, and you are not a moment. You are not a single outcome. You are not a decision made by someone else. You are something far more constant, far more stable, far more complete. And in that understanding, something settles deeply. The fear begins to fade. The weight begins to lift. The need to interpret begins to soften. And what remains is clarity. A quiet knowing that nothing external has the power to define what you are. That no moment of rejection can reduce your worth. That no outcome can change your reality. Because your reality is not built on selection. It is not built on approval. It is not built on being chosen. It is simply here, unchanged, unshaken, unaffected. And once you see that clearly, rejection loses its meaning. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer defines you. It simply passes, like everything else, leaving you exactly as you were, whole, complete, enough. And as the weight of rejection begins to dissolve, something even more subtle starts to come into view. Because when rejection no longer defines you, when being overlooked no longer carries meaning, another hidden pattern quietly reveals itself. A pattern that has been shaping your life in ways you may not have fully noticed. The sense that you are always being watched. Not always by real eyes, but by an imagined presence. A quiet awareness that sits in the background of your thoughts, observing, judging, measuring. A feeling that your life is not just being lived, but being seen. And this is where another layer begins to unfold. There is a strange habit that forms over time. The habit of turning your life into something that can be observed, something that can be approved, something that can be understood from the outside, and without realizing it, you begin to live as if there is always an audience, even when you are alone. There is a subtle shift in how you move. You think about how something looks, how it would be perceived, how it might be interpreted. And this changes the experience itself, because instead of being fully inside the moment, part of you is outside of it, watching, evaluating, adjusting. This is performative living, not always in obvious ways, not always for attention, but in small, quiet patterns. The way you choose what to share, the way you present your thoughts, the way you shape your actions to fit a certain image. And over time, this becomes normal. It becomes how you relate to your own life. But beneath it, there is a cost. Because when you are performing, you are not fully present. You are divided. Part of you is living. Part of you is observing. And this division creates a subtle tension, a feeling that something is slightly off, that something is not fully grounded. And this tension is often overlooked because it is familiar, because it has been there for so long. But when you begin to see it clearly, it becomes undeniable. You start to notice how often you are thinking about how things appear, how often you are adjusting based on an imagined response, how often you are shaping your experience to fit an external perspective. And this realization can be surprising, because it shows you that even when no one is watching, you are still performing, not for others, but for the idea of others, for the possibility of being seen. And this is where the habit becomes clear. You are not just living your life, you are presenting it. And presentation changes everything. It turns experience into display. It turns authenticity into performance. It turns presence into projection. And over time, this creates distance. Distance from your own reality. Distance from your own feelings. Distance from what is actually happening. Because you are no longer fully inside the moment. You are outside, looking in. And this distance creates a quiet dissatisfaction. Because something inside you knows. It knows when you are not fully there. It knows when you are acting instead of being. It knows when your actions are shaped by perception instead of truth. And this knowing creates discomfort. A subtle feeling that something is not aligned, that something is not real. This discomfort is not a problem. It is a signal that you are ready to return to direct experience, to return to presence, to return to living without performance. But this return requires awareness, because performative living is not always obvious. It hides in small behaviors, in habits, in patterns that feel normal. You may notice it when you do something and immediately think about how it would be seen. When you say something and wonder how it was received. When you experience something and feel the urge to share it, not because it needs to be shared, but because it feels incomplete otherwise. These are subtle signs, not of weakness, but of conditioning, a way of relating to life that was learned over time. And what is learned can be seen clearly. When you begin to notice these patterns, something shifts. You start to catch yourself in the moment. You begin to see the split. The part of you that is living, and the part that is performing. And in that seeing, there is choice. You can continue the pattern, or you can pause. You can bring your attention back to what is actually happening, back to your direct experience, back to the moment itself. And when you do this, something changes. The performance softens, the need to present fades, and you begin to feel more grounded, more present, more real, because you are no longer dividing your attention. You are fully here. This does not mean you stop sharing your life. It does not mean you withdraw. It simply means that sharing becomes a choice, not a need. Expression becomes natural, not performative. You act because it feels true, not because it will be seen. And this creates a different kind of experience. One that is quieter, but deeper, more complete. Because it is not filtered through perception. It is not shaped by expectation. It is simply lived. There is a kind of freedom that comes with this. A freedom from the invisible pressure to be observed. A freedom from the constant awareness of how you appear. A freedom from the need to turn every moment into something that can be seen. You begin to enjoy things more fully, not because they are impressive, but because they are real. A simple moment becomes enough. A quiet experience becomes complete, because you are no longer trying to make it into something else. You are simply allowing it to be what it is. This also changes how you relate to yourself. You stop seeing yourself as an image, as something to be presented, as something to be evaluated. You begin to experience yourself directly, without the filter, without the performance. And this creates a deeper sense of connection, a sense that you are no longer outside of yourself. Watching, but inside, living. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it removes a layer of effort, a layer that has been quietly draining your energy, the effort to maintain an image, to present yourself in a certain way, to constantly be aware of how you are perceived. When that effort is released, something opens up. Your energy returns. Your attention becomes clearer. Your presence becomes stronger. And in that presence, something becomes simple. You are no longer trying to live your life. You are just living it. Without performance, without presentation, without the need for an audience. And this simplicity brings peace, not a dramatic peace, but a quiet one, a steady sense of ease, because you are no longer divided. You are whole, fully engaged in your own experience. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to emerge. You start to see that the audience you were performing for was never fully real. It was a mental construction, a collection of imagined responses, expected reactions, projected opinions. And once you see that, its hold begins to weaken, because you realize that you were adjusting yourself based on something that was not actually present. You were shaping your life around perception, not reality. And when that becomes clear, the need to perform begins to dissolve, not all at once, but gradually. As you continue to return to the moment, to your own experience, to what is actually here, you begin to live more directly, more honestly, more freely. Because you are no longer referencing an audience, you are simply responding to life. And in that response, there is authenticity, not forced, not constructed, but natural, because it is not shaped by external perception. It is arising from within. This authenticity changes how everything feels, more grounded, more stable, more real, because it is not dependent on being seen. It is complete on its own. And as this becomes more natural, something settles deeply. The need to perform fades. The habit of presenting dissolves. The imagined audience disappears. And what remains is something simple, a life that is lived, not displayed, a presence that is felt, not performed, a self that is experienced, not projected. And in that simplicity, there is nothing missing, nothing to prove, nothing to show, just a quiet, steady way of being. That does not need an audience to be real. That does not need to be observed to be complete. That simply is, fully, naturally, at peace. And as the need to perform begins to fall away, something even quieter begins to reveal itself. Because when you are no longer living for an audience, no longer shaping your life to be seen, another question naturally rises beneath the silence. If nothing needs to be shown, then what is your worth really based on? There is a deep belief that has been guiding many lives without being questioned. A belief that says your value must be earned. That it comes after effort, after success, after recognition. That you must become something before you can feel like you are enough. And because of this belief, the mind is always moving forward, always trying, always building, always reaching for something that feels just out of reach, a future version of yourself that will finally be worthy. But this movement creates a quiet tension, because no matter how much you achieve, the feeling does not settle. It shifts, it moves, it asks for more. And this is where another illusion begins to show itself, the idea that worth is something that comes later, something that arrives after a certain point, something that must be built through accomplishment. But what if this idea is not true? There is something deeply ingrained in the way you have been taught to see yourself. You were shown that value is connected to doing, to producing, to achieving, to becoming. You were rewarded for results, recognized for outcomes, praised for performance, and slowly this created a connection, a belief that your worth increases with what you do, that without achievement there is less value, that before success there is something missing. But when you look closely, this belief creates an endless loop, because if your worth depends on achievement, it is never stable. It rises when you succeed. It falls when you do not. It is always changing, always uncertain.
always dependent. And this creates a life of constant movement, a life where you are always trying to prove something, even if you do not fully realize it. You may feel it in subtle ways, a pressure to be productive, a need to improve, a quiet dissatisfaction with where you are, a sense that you should be further along. These feelings are not random. They come from the belief that your current state is not enough, that your value exists somewhere ahead. But this belief overlooks something fundamental. You existed before you achieved anything, before you proved anything, before you became anything. And in that existence, there was already presence, already awareness, already life. Nothing was missing, nothing needed to be added. This is the inner source of worth, not something you create, not something you earn, but something that is already there. Before action, before result, before recognition. It is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it is constant. And when you begin to notice it, something shifts. You start to feel a different kind of grounding, a sense that your value is not moving, not dependent, not changing with outcomes, because it was never tied to them. This does not mean achievement becomes meaningless. You can still create, still grow, still move forward. But the reason changes. You are no longer trying to become worthy. You are expressing from worth. And this changes everything. Because when you act from a place of already being enough, there is no pressure to prove, no need to validate your existence through results. Your actions become lighter, more natural, more aligned. You do things because they feel true, not because they will make you more valuable. This also changes how you experience failure, because failure is often seen as a loss of worth, a sign that something is lacking. But when your worth is not tied to achievement, failure loses that meaning. It becomes information, experience, part of movement, not a reflection of who you are. And this creates resilience, not through force, but through understanding, because your foundation is not shaken by outcomes. It is steady, always present. This also softens comparison, because when you believe worth is earned, you naturally compare achievements. Who has more? Who has done better? Who is ahead? But when you see that worth exists before achievement, comparison begins to fade, because you are no longer measuring value through outcomes. You are recognizing it as something inherent, something shared, something that is not divided. And this brings a sense of ease. You no longer feel behind. You no longer feel the need to catch up. You are simply where you are, and that is enough. There is also a deeper peace that begins to form, because the constant pressure to become begins to soften. The feeling that you need to reach a certain point to be okay begins to dissolve. You begin to rest, not in inactivity, but in understanding, a quiet knowing that nothing is missing right now, that your value is not waiting in the future, it is already here. This does not stop growth. It supports it. Because growth that comes from lack feels forced, but growth that comes from wholeness feels natural. It is not driven by pressure, but by curiosity, by expression, by the natural movement of life. And this creates a different experience, one where you are not chasing worth, but living from it. You begin to notice simple things more deeply. Moments that were once overlooked become meaningful. Not because they are impressive, but because they are real. You begin to feel more present, more connected, because you are no longer trying to get somewhere else. You are here, fully, and in that presence, something becomes clear. You were never empty. You were never lacking. You were only looking in the wrong place, looking outward, looking forward, looking for something that was never missing. And once you see that, the search begins to end. Not completely, but significantly. You no longer chase worth. You no longer try to build it. You recognize it, quietly, directly, without effort. This recognition changes how you relate to yourself. You become less critical, less demanding, less harsh, because you are no longer trying to fix something that is broken. You are simply understanding what is already whole. This does not mean you ignore your flaws. It means you see them clearly without attaching them to your value. They are part of your experience, not a definition of your worth. And this creates compassion for yourself, for your process, for your journey, because you are no longer measuring everything against an ideal. You are simply observing, growing, learning, from a place that is already complete. This also changes how you interact with the world. You are less reactive, less pressured, less driven by external expectations, because your sense of self is not dependent on them. You are grounded, stable, present, and from that place, your actions become more genuine, more aligned, more impactful, not because you are trying to be, but because you are not divided. You are whole in what you do, and that wholeness carries through everything. There is a quiet strength in this, not loud, not forceful, but steady. A strength that comes from knowing you do not need to become something to be enough. You already are. And from that knowing, something settles deeply. The constant striving softens, the pressure eases, the need to prove fades, and what remains is something simple, a sense of being that is complete before achievement, a value that exists before recognition, a presence that is enough without anything added. And in that simplicity, there is peace, not because you have everything, but because you no longer feel like you are missing something. You are here, as you are, and that is enough, fully, completely, without condition, without requirement, without needing to become anything else, just being. And in that being, everything is already whole. You spent so much of your life waiting to be chosen, waiting to be seen, waiting for someone to confirm what you were already carrying within you. But now, something has shifted. You've seen through the illusion of approval, the emptiness of rejection, the weight of comparison, and the quiet trap of living for an audience. You've realized that your worth was never in their hands. It was never in outcomes, never in praise, never in being picked. It was always here, quiet, unmoving, unaffected. You are not valuable because someone noticed you. You are not enough because someone approved of you. You are not complete because something finally worked out. You are valuable because you exist. Before achievement, before recognition, before anything else was added. And once this becomes clear, everything changes. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop shrinking and adjusting just to be accepted. You begin to stand in something deeper, something steady, something that cannot be taken from you. Now I want to ask you something simple but powerful. What is one moment in your life where you were waiting to be chosen, when you didn't need to be? Drop it in the comments. Let it be honest. Let it be real. Someone else might read it and finally understand something they've been struggling with for years. And if this shifted something in you, if you felt even a small sense of clarity or relief, subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning.